Welcome, and thank you for being here tonight. What you're about to hear is not a story about triumph, though there is triumph in it. It is not a story about defeat, though defeat visits often and stays longer than anyone would wish. It is the story of what it costs to be good in a world that does not always reward goodness, of what is carried by someone who has chosen, again and again, to carry it. Spider-Man's story is often told through its brightest moments, its greatest victories, its most spectacular rescues. But tonight we will move through the quieter and more honest version of that story, the one that lives in the spaces between the heroics, in the losses that did not make the headlines, in the long interior nights of a young man who became something extraordinary and paid for it in ways that never fully stopped. Settle in now. Let the weight of the day begin to leave you. There is nothing you need to do, or remember, or resolve. Just let this story carry you, gently, through the dark. There is a particular quality to the loneliness of a child who is too much of something for the world immediately around him, a quality that is difficult to name precisely because it does not announce itself as loneliness in any dramatic sense. It does not arrive with the clear identifiable ache of someone who has lost a friend or been excluded from a party. It is subtler than that, more structural, more like a low and constant hum beneath the ordinary sounds of daily life, than like any single note played loudly enough to be heard from across a room. It is the loneliness of someone who has looked at the world and found that his natural responses to it, his curiosity, his seriousness, his instinct to go deeper rather than wider, do not quite match the responses that the world around him seems to consider normal, and who has learned, not dramatically, but gradually, and almost without noticing, to hold the best parts of himself a little more quietly than they would like to be held. Peter Benjamin Parker grew up in a modest house on Ingram Street, in the borough of Queens, New York, in a neighborhood of tree-lined sidewalks and local diners and modest homes, pressed close together in the way of places that were built for ordinary people living ordinary lives, and there was genuine warmth in that house. The kind of warmth that does not require wealth or spectacle to be real and sustaining. His Aunt May was a small woman of great internal steadiness, someone who tended the garden in the backyard with the same careful attention she gave to every living thing in her care, and his Uncle Ben was the kind of man who fixed things for neighbours who could not afford to pay anyone, who kept a workshop in the basement that was always cluttered with half-finished projects, and who had a gift for making people feel that their problems were worth taking seriously. The house on Ingram Street was full of photographs at every surface, of books that had been read more than once, of the particular smell of a home where meals were made from scratch, and no one went hungry for affection even when money was tight. Peter's parents, Richard and Mary Parker, had died when he was very young, in circumstances that remained somewhat abstract to him as a child, their absence more like a feature of the landscape of his life than like a wound with edges he could feel directly. He knew that they were gone, and that Ben and May had taken him in and raised him as their own, and the love in that arrangement was genuine and complete on all sides, but there is something that even the most devoted surrogate family cannot entirely replace, a specific gravity that biological parents provide simply by existing in the world, and their absence left a kind of weightlessness in Peter that he compensated for, perhaps without knowing it, by making himself very dense with interior life, very full of thoughts and questions and projects, and the particular hunger of someone who has decided that understanding things is the surest path toward feeling at home in them. At Midtown High School, Peter existed in that particular social position that is perhaps the most quietly uncomfortable one available to a teenager, not popular enough to be included and not troubled enough to be interesting, not invisible in the way that produces peace, but invisible in the way that produces the constant low-grade awareness of being overlooked. His teachers noticed him because his academic performance made him difficult to ignore, and his classmates noticed him because they needed someone to copy homework from or someone to serve as a contrast that made the social hierarchy feel more secure, but neither category of attention was the kind that feeds a person, and Peter had learned early that the interior world was more reliable than the exterior one when it came to finding nourishment. The interior world that Peter had built for himself was genuinely remarkable, a private architecture of scientific curiosity and moral seriousness that most adults would have recognized as extraordinary if they had been given access to it. His bedroom was a teenager's laboratory and library combined, his desk perpetually covered with homework and sketches and notes toward experiments he wanted to try, his walls decorated with photographs of scientists whose lives had demonstrated that intelligence could be a form of service rather than merely a form of advantage. He was drawn particularly to the question of how things worked, not in the shallow sense of wanting to take them apart, but in the deeper sense of wanting to understand the principles that governed their behavior, the forces that held things together or pushed them apart, the invisible relationships between elements that produced, at the visible level, the world as he experienced it. Flash Thompson was the primary external fact of Peter's social landscape at Midtown High, a boy whose confidence and physical presence filled whatever room he occupied, and whose habit of targeting Peter for casual cruelty was not, at its root, personal, which in some ways made it harder to bear rather than easier. Flash did not hate Peter, had no particular investment in his suffering beyond the minor social benefit of having someone to demonstrate dominance over in front of an audience, and the casualness of his cruelty was its own kind of insult, the suggestion that Peter was not worth the effort of genuine malice, only the effort of convenient contempt. What Peter did not know then, and what would later become one of the rich ironies woven through his life, was that Flash Thompson admired Spider-Man with a devotion that was almost religious, collected every photograph and news clipping he could find, defended the hero in arguments with anyone who questioned him, never once suspecting that his idol was the same boy whose lunch he had disrupted on a Tuesday in October. The quality of Peter's isolation was not one of bitterness, which is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the person he was before the spider bite and before all that followed. Another boy with the same experience might have turned his loneliness outward, might have made it sharp and used it to cut the world that had failed to see him. But Peter's response was more internal and more curious than that. He watched people with something approaching scientific interest, trying to understand why they behaved as they did, what governed the social systems around him, and what it would take to alter them. And in this watching, there was a kind of compassion that predated any powers or responsibilities, a natural tendency to extend understanding toward people even when they were not extending it toward him. Ben Parker understood something essential about his nephew that most adults in Peter's life missed entirely, perhaps because Ben was himself a man who had never been rewarded in proportion to his worth and had made a kind of peace with that discrepancy that was not resignation but something more active and more dignified. He talked to Peter about responsibility in the way that people talk about things they genuinely believe, rather than things they think they are supposed to say, not as a lecture but as an ongoing conversation about how a person navigates a world that does not always make navigating easy. He talked about power in the abstract, about what it meant to have something, whether that something was strength or intelligence or money or influence that others did not have, and what that created in terms of obligation. Peter listened to these conversations with the particular attention of someone who does not yet know they are receiving something they will spend the rest of their life trying to live up to. The house on Ingram Street was not a sad place, and Peter's childhood was not a tragic one in the sense that the word is usually used, but there was in it a particular quality of contained longing, of a boy who was bigger on the inside than the life available to him seemed to have room for, and that quality shaped him in ways that would only become fully visible later, when circumstances finally gave the interior life somewhere to go. The child who sat alone in the school cafeteria and watched the social currents around him with careful eyes was already, in some essential way, the man who would later swing above a sleeping city and feel something very like love for the strangers below, the people he did not know and would never meet, but could not bring himself to leave unprotected. The loneliness of his childhood was not wasted. It was composted into something richer and more useful than loneliness, into an understanding of what it means to need someone and have no one come, and that understanding would become the deepest source of his heroism, more fundamental than any radioactive bite or enhanced ability. The simple and irreducible knowledge of what it felt like to be overlooked, and the determination that as long as he was able to do something about it, he would. The field trip to the science exhibition at the State University was, by all ordinary measures, an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon in the life of a 15-year-old boy who'd been on enough school excursions to know that the gap between the promised wonder of such events and their actual delivery was usually considerable. The bus ride from Midtown High was the same as any other bus ride, the same noise and jostling, the same careful arrangement of social groups within the available seating, Flash Thompson occupying the back with his usual retinue, while Peter found a window seat near the middle and watched Queens give way to Manhattan, with the particular quality of attention he brought to most things, not quite present in the ordinary social sense, but deeply present in some other sense that was harder to name, alert to textures and patterns in a way that had no immediate practical application, but that felt to him like the most natural way of being in the world. The exhibition hall itself was impressive in the way that scientific institutions sometimes manage to be impressive even to people who have seen many such places, its high ceilings and carefully arranged displays suggesting that the things happening within its walls were of genuine consequence, that the work being done here was part of something larger than any individual experiment or demonstration. The class filed in with the shuffling, half-attentive energy of teenagers who have been told that this will be educational and have made their peace with that, finding seats in the tiered lecture area where the afternoon's demonstration was to take place. Peter settled into his seat and looked around with genuine interest, reading the labels on the equipment arranged on the demonstration table, identifying the instruments, tracing the probable purpose of each setup with the quiet satisfaction of someone for whom this kind of recognition is one of the small, reliable pleasures of daily life. The researcher conducting the demonstration spoke about radioactivity with the careful enthusiasm of someone who has devoted their professional life to a subject and retains, after all that time, genuine affection for it, explaining the ways in which controlled radiation was being studied for medical applications, for materials science, for the understanding of biological processes at the cellular level. Peter listened with more attention than most of his classmates, occasionally glancing at the notes he was making in the margin of his program, occasionally looking up to follow the thread of an explanation that connected to something he had read. The demonstration moved through several stations, plants whose growth had been altered by carefully measured exposure, metals whose properties had been changed in ways that had practical industrial applications, and then, almost as an aside, a small glass enclosure within which a spider moved with the unhurried purposefulness of a creature that has no awareness of being observed. The spider was not remarkable to look at, small and dark against the pale interior of its enclosure, its movements the ordinary movements of its kind, the methodical exploration of available space that is simply what spiders do when they are alive and untroubled. The researcher mentioned it briefly, noting that the specimen had been exposed to a carefully calibrated level of radiation as part of a study into the effects of such exposure on invertebrate physiology, that preliminary observations suggested some alterations in cellular structure, and then moved on to the next element of the demonstration. Peter noted it with the same interested attention he gave everything else, and returned to his marginal notes. What happened next was the kind of thing that, in retrospect, acquires the quality of inevitability, as though the universe had been arranging its pieces toward this particular configuration for a very long time, and was now simply allowing them to fall into place. The enclosure had not been properly secured, a small oversight of the kind that happens in busy laboratories where the protocols for public demonstrations are sometimes slightly less rigorous than those for controlled research environments, and the spider, moving along the upper edge of its enclosure as spiders will, found the gap and descended from it on a thread so fine as to be invisible in the ambient light of the lecture hall. It moved through the air above the seated students with the patient, purposeful quality of something that does not understand urgency, and therefore does not experience it. Peter was not paying attention to the space directly above him. He was looking at his notes, his pen moving slowly as he completed a thought he had been developing about the relationship between radiation exposure and cellular membrane permeability, his mind in that particular state of partial absorption that is not quite concentration and not quite daydreaming, but something in between, a productive interior looseness that he had learned to cultivate because it was often in this state that connections between things became visible to him. He did not see the spider descend. He did not feel it land. What he felt, with a suddenness that was entirely out of proportion to the size of the creature responsible for it, was a sharp and vivid pain on the back of his right hand, specific and bright in a way that ordinary pain is not, as though something had been injected rather than merely punctured. He looked down and saw it, small and faintly luminescent in a way that it had not appeared to be inside its enclosure, already withdrawing its chelicerae, already beginning the slow curl of a creature expending its last resources. He brushed it away with a reflex that was more startled than deliberate, watched it fall to the floor and lie still, and then returned his attention to the pain in his hand, which was spreading now in a way that a normal insect bite does not spread, moving up through the metacarpals and into his wrist with a warmth that felt chemical, rather than simply inflammatory, purposeful rather than merely reactive. He pressed his palm against his knee and said nothing, because there was a demonstration happening and he did not want to disrupt it, and because the pain, though vivid, was not the kind that seemed to require immediate attention, and because 15-year-old boys who have spent their entire lives being told that they are too sensitive about things have generally learned to err on the side of underreaction. The warmth continued to spread through the remainder of the demonstration, moving up his forearm and into his shoulder with a patience that was almost systematic, as though it was working through a list of destinations rather than simply diffusing the way warmth ordinarily diffuses. By the time the researcher concluded and invited questions from the students, Peter's vision had begun to behave in ways that vision does not ordinarily behave, sharpening and then blurring in alternating waves, colours shifting slightly in their saturation, edges acquiring a quality of definition that was almost uncomfortable in its precision. He stood with the rest of the class when they were directed to move on, and found that standing required more conscious attention than it usually did, that the ordinary act of balancing his weight across his feet was something he was now having to think about rather than simply do. The walk back to the bus moved through him more than he moved through it, the sounds of the city outside the exhibition building arriving at his ears with an intensity that seemed calibrated for someone much closer to their source, the smell of exhaust and food and the particular mineral quality of Manhattan pavement, registering with a specificity that his senses did not normally achieve. He sat on the bus with his hand pressed flat against his thigh and watched Queen's return outside the window, and tried to decide whether he was becoming ill in the ordinary sense or whether something else was happening, something that did not have a name yet in the vocabulary available to a 15-year-old boy in 1962. Aunt May took one look at his face when he came through the door of the house on Ingram Street, and did what Aunt May did when she looked at someone's face and concluded that they needed care, which was to move with quiet efficiency toward the practical expression of that care, producing aspirin and cool water and the particular chicken soup that she made from a recipe that had been her mother's and that she believed, with a faith that was not entirely unsupported by evidence, to be efficacious against most of the ailments that afflicted human beings. She helped him up to his room and told him to rest, and Ben came in later with the warm and slightly awkward tenderness of a man who has never been entirely comfortable in the presence of illness, because it reminds him of things he cannot fix, and sat on the edge of the bed for a few minutes and told Peter that he would feel better in the morning, and there was in his voice the particular quality of conviction that comes not from certainty, but from the deep desire for a thing to be true. Peter lay in the dark of his bedroom and felt his body doing things that bodies do not do. His temperature moved through several different registers over the course of the evening, climbing and dropping in cycles that produced, in alternation, the bone-deep chill of a serious fever and the drenching heat of its breaking. And between these cycles there were periods of a strange and luminous clarity in which he was more awake than he had ever been, in which he could hear the sound of May's breathing from the next room and Ben's footsteps on the stairs with a precision that seemed to belong to a different and more capable instrument than his ordinary ears. He slept eventually, but the sleep was not restful in the usual sense, was instead a landscape of images that moved with a logic that was not narrative but physical, sensory, the experience of a body discovering what it had become before the mind had any framework for understanding it. He dreamed of walls. He dreamed of the sensation of pressing his hands against a surface and feeling it hold him, of moving upward against gravity with an ease that felt not like effort, but like rightness, like the resolution of a tension that had always been present and was only now being released. He dreamed of the city from above, the specific quality of height that is not frightening but clarifying, the way that altitude simplifies the pattern of things, reduces the noise of the ground-level world to something quieter and more comprehensible. These were not frightening dreams. They were, in a way that he could not have explained and did not try to, deeply familiar, as though something that had always been true about him was only now finding its proper form. When morning came, Peter Parker was a different person in ways that took him the better part of the early hours to fully inventory. The glasses he reached for automatically were unnecessary, a fact he discovered when he put them on and found that they reduced rather than improved his vision, that the world without them was sharper and more detailed than it had ever been with them. colours more distinct, edges more precise, the dust motes moving in the shaft of morning light through his bedroom window visible as individual particles rather than as a general luminous haze. He set the glasses on his desk and sat with this for a moment. The strangeness of looking at a familiar room and finding it transformed not by any change in the room itself, but by a change in the quality of his attention to it. The strength revealed itself by accident, as strength of that order tends to, because it is calibrated for a world that does not yet exist around its possessor, a world where the ordinary objects of daily life have the density and resistance of something much more substantial than they actually are. He reached for the wooden headboard of his bed, and his grip, closing with the casual pressure of someone simply steadying themselves as they stand, left the clear impression of his fingers in the solid oak, not a crack or a split, but a smooth compression, as though the wood had been softer than wood is. He stood very still and looked at this for a long time, and the feeling that moved through him was not triumph or excitement in the simple sense, but something more complex. The feeling of a person standing at the edge of a country they did not know existed, uncertain whether they have been given a gift or a problem, and suspecting, with the part of them that has always understood things clearly, that it is probably both. The wall happened next, again by accident, again in the way of things that are too large to be approached directly, and so must be stumbled into sideways. He reached out to steady himself against the wall beside his window, and his palm adhered to it with a solidity that had nothing to do with friction or suction in any conventional sense, that felt instead like something structural, like the grip was happening at the level of the material itself. He stood there with his hand flat against the wall, and understood that he was not going to fall, that whatever had changed in him overnight had changed the relationship between his body and the surfaces it encountered in a way that made falling something he would have to choose to do. He pressed his other hand to the wall. He lifted his feet. He stood on the wall beside his window for a long moment, looking at his bedroom from an angle that no one had ever looked at it from before, and felt something that was almost, but not quite, like joy. There was also the other thing, the one that was hardest to describe because it had no precedent in any experience he had previously had, no analogy in the science he had read or the observations he had made. It was a kind of awareness that extended beyond the ordinary boundaries of his body and his senses, a low and constant perception of the space around him that registered the movement of things before his eyes reported them, that produced, in the presence of approaching objects or sudden changes in his immediate environment, something that was not quite a thought and not quite a feeling, but that functioned like a very fast and very reliable version of both. He would come to call it his spider sense eventually, when he had language for it. But in those early hours it was simply an additional fact about the world, another feature of the transformed landscape he now inhabited, at once bewildering, and, like the wall and the strength, strangely familiar, as though it was something that had always been trying to exist in him, and had finally, through some accident of chemistry and radiation, been given the conditions it required. He spent the hours of that morning while May and Ben believed him still resting in his room, moving carefully through the private catalogue of what he had become, testing each ability with the methodical attention of a scientist who understands that the first task in any new situation is accurate observation rather than interpretation. He lifted the desk with one hand and held it at arm's length, feeling the weight of it as something modest and manageable, a fraction of what it should have been. He dropped a pencil and caught it before it travelled 6 inches, his hand arriving at the interception point before any conscious decision to move had been made. He walked up the wall to the ceiling and hung there, looking down at the reversed room below him, and breathed slowly and thought about what any of this could possibly mean for the life he was living and the person he had been 24 hours ago. What he did not think about in those early hours was responsibility. He was 15 years old, and he was extraordinary in a way that no one he had ever known or read about had been extraordinary. And the mind of a 15-year-old presented with that fact does not immediately and naturally travel toward obligation. It travels toward possibility, toward the sudden expansion of a world that had previously felt constraining in ways he had not even fully articulated to himself, toward the private and intoxicating knowledge that the boy who had been invisible at Midtown High School was now something else entirely, something that the social hierarchies of high school had no category for and therefore no power over. The loneliness of the interior life he had been living felt, in those first hours, like it was about to be resolved in a way that the interior life alone could never have managed, like the world was about to have to make room for him in a way it had previously declined to do. This feeling, warm and expansive and understandable in every way, was the first thing his powers gave him. It would not be the last, and it would not be in the end the most important. But it was the first, and it is worth holding gently for a moment before moving on, worth recognizing it for what it was. The entirely human response of a lonely and overlooked boy to the sudden discovery that the world was larger than it had appeared, that he was larger than it had appeared, and that whatever came next, he would be meeting it as someone who could no longer be so easily ignored. The days that followed the morning of discovery had a quality of private exhilaration that Peter had no framework for sharing, and no one to share it with in any case, and so he carried it the way he had always carried the things that mattered most to him, inwardly and carefully, letting it inform everything while revealing nothing to the surface of his daily life. He returned to school and sat through his classes and walked the familiar hallways of Midtown High, with a strange doubled experience of someone who is simultaneously in a place and somewhere else entirely. Present enough to function, and absent enough to be continuously amazed by the gap between what the people around him perceived and what was actually true. Flash Thompson's shoulder in the hallway registered as something almost comical now. The casual assertion of physical dominance from someone who had no idea that the person he was asserting it over could have lifted him one-handed without particular effort, and Peter absorbed the contact and kept walking, and felt, for the first time in his experience of that particular dynamic, something approaching lightness rather than the familiar low-grade humiliation. He had been thinking, in the way that his mind worked when it was given a problem with genuine stakes, about what to do with what he had become. The scientific part of him wanted to understand the mechanism, to study the changes in his physiology with the same careful attention he would have brought to any other observable phenomenon, and he had already begun making notes in a private journal that he kept separate from his school notebooks, documenting his abilities with the precision of someone who believes that accurate records are the foundation of any meaningful understanding. But there was another part of him, younger and less disciplined than the scientist, that was less interested in understanding the phenomenon than in experiencing it, in finding out what the edges of this new self actually were, and what it felt like to move through a world that could no longer contain him in the ways it previously had. The advertisement for the wrestling match appeared in a newspaper that was lying on the kitchen table one evening, while May was cooking and Ben was in the basement with one of his repair projects, and Peter read it with the particular attention of someone who has been unconsciously looking for exactly this kind of thing without knowing they were looking. A prize of $100 to anyone who could remain in the ring for 3 minutes with a professional wrestler named Joseph Crusher Hogan, a sum that represented to Peter not merely money, though the Parker household always had a careful relationship with money, but a concrete and measurable test of what his new abilities actually amounted to in the world beyond his bedroom walls. He tore the advertisement from the paper with a neatness that suggested the decision had already been made before the conscious mind had fully caught up with it. The costume he assembled in the privacy of his room over the following 2 evenings was rudimentary in a way that he would later look back on with something between affection and mild embarrassment. A red shirt with a web pattern, drawn in black marker, blue trousers, a mask that covered most of his face and was held in place by a combination of careful tailoring and the kind of optimism that is available only to people who have never actually worn a homemade mask while engaging in physical activity. He had also, drawing on his scientific knowledge, and the resources available in his bedroom laboratory, constructed a pair of mechanical devices that he attached to his wrists, designed to project a web-like fluid he had synthesized himself, a solution whose adhesive and tensile properties he had calculated with considerable care and tested quietly in the backyard on a Sunday afternoon while May was visiting a neighbour. He had chosen a name almost as an afterthought, writing it on the sign-up sheet at the arena's administrative office, with a slightly self-conscious decisiveness of someone performing a gesture whose significance they can feel even if they cannot yet fully articulate it. Spider-Man. The wrestling arena was the kind of place that exists in every large city, fulfilling a need that is difficult to articulate in polite company, but that is genuine and persistent, a need for spectacle and contest and the particular release that comes from watching physical conflict in a controlled environment. The air inside was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of cheap food and something older and more fundamental than either. the smell of a space that has absorbed decades of human excitement and disappointment and is now simply saturated with the general atmosphere of stakes and outcome. Peter waited in the dressing area in his improvised costume and felt the noise of the crowd as something almost physical, a pressure against his enhanced senses that required active management, and breathed carefully and thought about the geometry of the ring and the documented fighting style of his opponent, and all the other things that the scientific part of his mind offered as alternatives to simply being nervous. What happened in the ring that evening was the first time that Peter Parker performed his abilities in public, and the memory of it would stay with him for reasons that had less to do with the victory itself than with the feeling the victory produced. A feeling he had not previously had access to, and would spend a long time afterward trying to understand and then trying, with less success, to replicate through other means. Crusher Hogan was a large and competent man who had spent his professional life in wrestling rings, and knew them the way sailors know the sea, intuitively and with a respect for their capacity for surprise, and his initial assessment of the skinny teenager across the ring from him was the assessment of a professional sizing up an amateur, thorough and not unkind, and entirely incorrect. The 3 minutes that followed were not what anyone in that building had expected, including Peter himself, because there is a difference between knowing intellectually what your abilities are and experiencing what they actually feel like when deployed at full capacity against genuine resistance, and the knowledge that the gap between himself and every other person in that building was larger than he had quite understood, settled into him during those 3 minutes, with a weight that was partly exhilarating and partly something else. Something quieter and less comfortable that he did not examine closely. The crowd's response was the thing that reached him most deeply, because it was the first time in his memory that a room full of people had directed something unambiguously positive toward him, had looked at him with admiration rather than indifference or contempt, and the warmth of it was intoxicating in the precise sense that things are intoxicating when they supply, suddenly and in quantity, something that has been withheld for a long time. He stood in the ring while the crowd cheered and felt the particular dizziness of someone receiving more than they had prepared themselves to receive, and the television producer who approached him afterward with an offer and a handshake, and the easy authority of someone accustomed to identifying things that can be made profitable, found a 15-year-old boy who was perhaps more susceptible to the idea of continued recognition than he would have been had the recognition not felt quite so much like oxygen after a long time spent underwater. The television appearance came within the week, arranged with an efficiency that the entertainment industry reserves for things it believes will generate revenue quickly, and Peter stood before the studio audience in his costume and performed feats that produced from the assembled people exactly the kind of response that the wrestling crowd had produced, amplified by the presence of cameras and the knowledge that what was happening here would be transmitted into living rooms across the city. He walked up the wall beside the stage. He lifted objects of improbable weight with the casual ease of someone for whom improbable weight is simply weight. He moved with a speed and precision that the studio lighting made almost beautiful, and the host treated him with the warm and slightly proprietary enthusiasm that television hosts extend to things they believe are going to be good for their ratings, and Peter smiled behind his mask and felt the warmth of being seen, truly seen for what he actually was, and mistook that warmth for something it was not. He was leaving the television studio through a service corridor, counting the money in the envelope that had been pressed into his hands by a production assistant, already calculating how much of it could go toward the microscope he wanted, and how much toward the household expenses that he was aware of in the peripheral way of children who are not directly told about financial pressures, but who absorb them through the atmosphere of careful decisions and quiet economies that such pressures produce when the man ran past him. He was running with the specific urgency of someone who has done something and needs to not be where they did it, clutching a bag that swung heavily at his side, his footsteps loud in the corridor, and behind him came a security guard, older and slower, whose voice when he called out for someone to stop the thief carried the particular breathlessness of a man who knows he cannot close the distance himself, and is appealing to anyone within range who might be able to. Peter stepped to the side of the corridor to let the man pass. He did this without significant deliberation, which is perhaps the most honest and most important thing to understand about that moment, because it was not a carefully reasoned decision in the way that his later decisions would sometimes be, was not the product of a philosophical position he had thought through, or a cost-benefit analysis he had run. It was more instinctive than that, The instinct of someone who has just been told by the accumulated experience of the last several weeks that his abilities exist for his benefit, that the world has been withholding something from him and is now, finally, beginning to pay what it owes, and that the obligation this creates runs in one direction only, toward his own advancement and satisfaction, not toward strangers in corridors who represent no particular claim on his attention. The security guard looked at him with an expression that Peter would remember for the rest of his life. Not angry, but bewildered. The face of someone who has encountered something that does not fit any category they have available for human behaviour. He went that way, Peter said, which was true and entirely useless, and continued toward the exit. And the money in the envelope was the same money it had been a moment before, and the night air outside the building was the same night air, and nothing had changed in any way that was visible or that he could have named. And so he went home on the subway and went to bed and did not think about it again in any serious way. Because there was nothing to think about. Because nothing had happened. Because a stranger had run past him in a corridor and he had let him go. And this was not an event. It was merely a non-event. The ordinary daily fact of one person declining to involve themselves in someone else's problem. The call came 11 days later. He was in his room, a Thursday evening in the second week of November, working on homework with one part of his mind and composing plans for his next public appearance with another. When he heard the telephone in the hallway downstairs and then heard Aunt May's voice change in the way that voices change when they receive information that the body understands before the mind has finished processing it, a shift from warmth to a different register entirely, tighter and smaller, as though the voice has drawn back into itself to make room for something that is coming. He heard her call for Ben, and then the low exchange of voices that he could now hear with perfect clarity, but that he found, in that moment, he did not want to hear with perfect clarity, and so he did something he almost never did, which was to simply sit still and wait for the information to come to him, rather than moving toward it. It came in the form of Aunt May appearing at his bedroom door with a face that had reorganized itself around something new and terrible, and the words she used were simple and direct in the way that people are simple and direct when they are delivering information that cannot be softened by any arrangement of language, and the information was that Ben had been hurt, that there had been an incident at a place he sometimes worked in the evenings for extra money, that the police were on the phone and they needed to go to the hospital now. The drive was the kind of experience that later exists in memory not as a continuous sequence, but as a series of images without the connective tissue of ordinary time between them. The specific quality of the car's interior in the dark, the way the streetlights moved across May's profile as she sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap, with a stillness that was not calm but its opposite. The way the hospital appeared at the end of a street that seemed too ordinary for what was waiting at the end of it, white and fluorescent and indifferent to the particular nature of any individual crisis it was receiving. The doctor who spoke to them had the manner of someone who has delivered this kind of information many times and has developed a way of doing it that is genuinely compassionate and also genuinely insufficient, because no manner is sufficient for this particular kind of information, and the words he used arranged themselves in Peter's hearing into a meaning that his mind accepted before his heart did, which is always the order in which these things happen, the intellect arriving first at the destination, and then waiting in a kind of terrible patience for the emotional self to make the same journey. Ben was gone. He had tried to stop a burglar at the warehouse where he was working that evening, had intervened with the directness of a man who believes that intervening is simply what a person does when they have the opportunity to prevent harm to others, and the burglar had shot him. And he had not survived long enough for the ambulance to deliver him anywhere that could have changed that outcome. The man who had called Peter Tiger, and fixed things for neighbours, and talked about responsibility as though it were not a burden, but a privilege, had been killed by a stranger for the contents of a warehouse. He was being paid a modest hourly rate to protect, and the universe had not paused or acknowledged this, or offered any indication that it understood what had been lost. Peter excused himself. He said something about needing air, which was true in a sense that went beyond the literal, and he found a bathroom and stood inside it for a moment with his hands on the edge of the sink, looking at his own face in the mirror, and the face that looked back at him was the face of someone in the process of becoming something they had not been before, not Spider-Man. That transformation had already happened, but something else. Something that had no name yet and was assembling itself from the materials of grief and shock, and underneath both of those beginning to surface with a cold deliberateness that he did not try to stop, the first intimation of a question that he needed to answer. He changed into his costume in the stall of a hospital bathroom, and the action had none of the excitement of the previous times he had done it, was simply functional, the preparation of an instrument for a purpose. Finding the killer took less time than it might have taken anyone else, because his spider sense navigated the nighttime city with a purposefulness that ordinary detective work could not have matched. Because the police cordon around the warehouse was designed to keep out people who could not climb walls and move through shadows without making sounds that patrols could detect. He tracked the man through the industrial waterfront with the particular focus of someone who has set aside every other consideration in favour of a single objective, and the city around him, usually a source of 1,000 overlapping stimuli that he had learned to manage and even to appreciate, was tonight simply geography, the arrangement of surfaces between himself and where he needed to be. He found the man in an abandoned warehouse at the waterfront's edge, hunched over the money he had taken, counting it with the concentration of someone who has not yet fully processed that they have killed a person and left behind them a specific and irreversible devastation, or perhaps who has processed it and found it less significant than the money. Peter dropped from the ceiling and the man turned, and for a long and terrible moment they simply looked at each other across the dusty floor of the warehouse, and then Peter's web line caught him and held him against the wall with a thoroughness that made physical resistance irrelevant, and the man's face turned toward the light, and Peter saw it. He had replayed this moment many times in the years that followed, trying to identify with precision what had happened in his body and mind in that fraction of a second of recognition, trying to understand how it was possible to receive the entirety of a consequence in a single instant of perception. The face of the man who had run past him in the television studio corridor 11 days ago was the face of the man who had shot Ben Parker on a Thursday evening for the money in a warehouse, and these two facts, which had existed separately in Peter's understanding of the world until that moment, collapsed into each other with a completeness that left no ambiguity and no room for the kind of comfortable uncertainty that might have made what followed slightly more bearable. He had let this man go. He had stepped to the side of a corridor and let this man run past him and told himself that it was not his problem, not his responsibility, not his concern, that his abilities existed for his own benefit and that the obligation to act was someone else's and not his. And this man had gone from that corridor to a warehouse in Queens and had shot Ben Parker, who had talked about responsibility as though it were not a burden but a privilege, and Ben Parker was dead in a hospital across the city. And Aunt May was sitting in a waiting room with folded hands and a face reorganized around something new and terrible, and all of it, every cell and fibre of this devastation, traced itself back to a choice that Peter had made in a corridor 11 days ago, when the cost of that choice had seemed like nothing because it had not yet arrived. He left the man webbed to the wall with a note for the police that the criminal justice system processed in its ordinary way, and he walked out of the warehouse and into the night air of the waterfront, and stood for a long time looking at the lights of the city reflected in the dark water below, and what moved through him was not simple grief, though grief was part of it, and not simple guilt, though guilt was the loudest component, but something more comprehensive than either, the sensation of a worldview reorganizing itself around a truth it cannot unlearn, of a self encountering the specific shape of its own worst failure, and being required to live inside that shape going forward, to carry it not as an excuse or an explanation, but as the permanent and non-negotiable context for every choice that followed. He walked home through the streets of Queens in his Spider-Man costume as the night deepened around him, and the city continued its ordinary life on either side of him, indifferent and various and alive, and he made in the wordless way that the most significant decisions are often made, not as a declaration, but as a settling, a quiet and total reorientation of the interior compass, the choice that would govern everything that came after. The powers that the radioactive spider had given him would not serve him. They would serve the city that had been Ben Parker's city, the strangers that Ben would have helped without being asked, the people in corridors from whom he would never again look away. This was not a heroic feeling, in the sense that heroism is usually portrayed, was not warm or elevating or accompanied by any sense of triumph. It was simply what was true, and it was the only response available to someone who understood, finally and completely and at great cost, what his uncle had been trying to tell him all along. With great power, Ben had said, in the way of someone describing not a rule but a fact of nature, comes great responsibility. Peter had heard it. He had simply not, until tonight, understood what it meant to know it. The weeks that followed Ben's death had a texture that Peter would later recognize as the specific texture of a life being rebuilt from its foundations, while the person doing the rebuilding was still living inside it. Still getting up in the morning and eating breakfast and going to school and coming home to a house that was the same house it had always been. And also, in some quality that had nothing to do with its physical arrangement, entirely different. May moved through her grief with a dignity that was not performance, but simply the expression of her character under pressure. The same steadiness that had always defined her now applied to the task of continuing to exist in a world from which Ben had been removed, and Peter watched her do this and loved her for it in a way that was new and more serious than the love he had felt before. The love of someone who understands for the first time what the person they love is actually made of. He had made his vow on the waterfront, and the vow was real and total, and he did not question it. But the practical architecture of living inside that vow was something that had to be invented day by day, because there was no template for what he was trying to do, and no one he could ask for guidance. And the gap between the moral clarity of commitment and the logistical complexity of its execution was wider than he had anticipated and required a kind of patient, improvisational intelligence that was different from any problem he had previously tried to solve. He was 15 years old, and he was going to protect New York City, and he needed to figure out how to do that, while also attending high school, and caring for Aunt May, and not failing his examinations and not letting anyone discover what he was. And the ordinary demands of adolescent life continued to press against the extraordinary ones, with a consistency that left very little space for anything resembling rest. The costume was the first practical problem that demanded serious attention, because the improvised outfit that had served adequately for a wrestling match and a television appearance was not adequate for the actual work of crime fighting in any serious sense. The mask allowed insufficient airflow during extended physical exertion. The web shooters, while functional in controlled conditions, had a tendency to malfunction under the variable pressures of real pursuit and real combat, jamming at moments when jamming was the worst possible outcome and producing too much fluid or too little, with a randomness that could not be predicted or compensated for in the moment. He spent several evenings in the weeks following Ben's death at his desk in the late hours when May was asleep, working on the design with the methodical attention of an engineer who understands that the quality of the tool is inseparable from the quality of the work it enables, testing formulas and adjusting mechanisms and sewing modifications into the fabric of the costume with a patience that his grief, rather than impeding, seemed in some way to sharpen. The web fluid itself required the most sustained scientific attention, because the demands he was placing on it, the need for it to support his weight at speed, to adhere to a wide range of surface materials, to maintain its integrity through significant temperature variation, and then to dissolve cleanly after a predictable interval, so that it did not leave permanent evidence of his passage, were demands that no existing adhesive material came close to meeting. He worked on the formula the way he worked on everything that genuinely interested him, which was to say obsessively and with pleasure, even when the problem was frustrating, drawing on his knowledge of polymer chemistry and adhesion science, and the specific properties of spider silk that he had been studying since the bite, with an interest that was no longer merely academic. The final formula took 3 weeks, and more than 40 iterations, and when it worked correctly it was, by any objective measure, one of the most impressive pieces of materials science that a 15-year-old had ever produced, though there was no one he could tell this to and no venue in which it could be recognized. The web shooters underwent parallel development, their mechanism refined through successive versions until the trigger sensitivity and the flow rate were consistent enough to be relied upon, until the cartridge system allowed for rapid replacement in the field, until the whole apparatus was compact enough to be worn beneath ordinary clothing without creating visible bulk. He wore them constantly in the weeks of their development, getting used to the weight and the presence of them, training his hands to reach for the trigger with an accuracy that required no conscious thought, so that in the moments when he needed them, the action would already be below the level of deliberate control and he could direct his attention to the larger situation, rather than to the mechanics of the tool. The camera system was an invention born of specific and practical necessity, and the ingenuity of it gave Peter a quiet satisfaction that was one of the few uncomplicated pleasures available to him during this period. He needed money. This was not a new condition. The Parker household had always had a careful relationship with money. But Ben's death had removed the income that had made careful management sufficient, and May's expenses, both ordinary and medical, required more than careful management could address. Peter was 16 years old, and the legitimate employment options available to a 16-year-old in 1962 were not numerous, and none of them were compatible with the irregular hours and physical demands of crime fighting. But he had a camera, a reasonable one that Ben had given him for his birthday 2 years before, and he had observed during his early nighttime activities that the events he was involved in were precisely the kind of events that newspapers paid well for photographs of, dynamic and dramatic and featuring the increasingly well-known masked figure that the city's press had begun to discuss with the mixture of curiosity and suspicion that New York reserved for things it had not yet decided how to classify. The technical challenge of photographing himself in action while simultaneously being in action was the kind of problem that, once he had decided to solve it, organized itself into a series of subsidiary problems, each of which had a tractable solution. He needed a mounting system that could attach a camera to a surface or a web line and hold it stable enough for a clear image while he moved within its field of view. He needed a trigger mechanism that could be activated remotely, either on a timer or by some wireless signal he could send from a distance. He needed to be able to set the apparatus up quickly in field conditions, often before a confrontation that might not wait for careful preparation, and to retrieve it afterward without leaving equipment behind that might be traced to him or examined by people with resources to follow such traces. He solved each of these problems in turn, and the final system that he arrived at was inelegant by laboratory standards, but effective by practical ones, a set of small bracket mounts that could be attached to most surfaces with a modified Webb formula, a timer mechanism adapted from components available at any electronic supply store, and a remote trigger that he could activate with a particular movement of his web-shooting hand that would not interfere with the movement's primary function. He brought his first batch of photographs to the Daily Bugle on a Tuesday morning before school, climbing the stairs to the editorial floor with the particular combination of confidence and anxiety that accompanies the first presentation of work one believes in to people whose opinion of it is unknown and consequential. The Bugle's offices had the organized chaos of a working newspaper. Desks covered with paper and people moving between them with the urgent purposefulness of individuals who are always working against a deadline, the air carrying the particular smell of newsprint and coffee and something more abstract, the smell of a place where the day's events are being processed and transformed into the version of them that will reach the public's breakfast table tomorrow morning. A picture editor looked at Peter's photographs with the professional detachment of someone who sees hundreds of images a week and is therefore immune to being impressed by most of them, and then looked at them again with something that was not quite detachment, and quoted him a figure that was lower than Peter had hoped for and higher than he had feared, and asked him if he had more. He had more. He would always have more, because he was producing the images himself, and therefore their supply was limited only by his willingness to keep going out at night, and his ability to anticipate the angles from which the most dramatic images could be captured, which was not a limitation at all given that the subject of the photographs was also their photographer. He sold to the Bugle consistently through the remainder of his junior year, and the income, while modest, was real. And it arrived with a regularity that allowed May to maintain the household without the specific indignity of not knowing from 1 week to the next whether the numbers would work out. J. Jonah Jameson entered Peter's life as a force rather than a person, which was perhaps the most accurate way to encounter him, because Jameson at full operational capacity was less an individual than a weather system, generating his own atmospheric conditions in whatever space he occupied and requiring everyone within that space to accommodate themselves to his particular climate. Peter's first direct encounter with him came after several weeks of selling through the picture editor, when Jameson summoned the young photographer who was producing the Spider-Man images to his office with the peremptory directness of a man who has never fully accepted that other people have schedules that might compete with his own. The office was large and aggressively furnished with the trophies of a journalistic career that Jameson was clearly not modest about, plaques and framed front pages and photographs of the publisher, with various figures of civic and political importance arranged on every available surface, with a thoroughness that suggested deliberate self-mythologizing rather than simple accumulation. Jameson himself sat behind his desk in a cloud of cigar smoke that the ventilation of the room was evidently not designed to manage. A compact and forceful man with a flat-topped haircut and a moustache of impressive authority, whose entire physical presentation communicated the conviction that he was always the most important person in any room he occupied, and that rooms were lucky to have him. He looked at Peter's photographs with the eyes of a publisher, which is to say with the eyes of someone who is evaluating images not for their aesthetic quality or their documentary accuracy, but for their capacity to sell newspapers, and his conclusion was that they were good for this purpose, that the public appetite for Spider-Man material was not diminishing, and that a reliable source of quality images was a commercial asset worth cultivating. He also made clear, in language that was direct to the point of being deliberately impolite, that his personal view of Spider-Man was not one that Peter's photographs were going to alter, that he considered the masked vigilante a dangerous and irresponsible element in the city's life, and that the paper's coverage of Spider-Man's activities would reflect this editorial position regardless of how dramatic or flattering the accompanying photographs might be. Peter listened to this with the careful neutrality of someone who needs the relationship and cannot afford the luxury of responding honestly to provocation, and accepted the terms that were offered, and walked back through the Bugle's offices toward the elevator with the strange experience of someone who has just been told, by his own employer, that the most significant thing in his life is a menace to society. The irony was not lost on him. It would never entirely be lost on him. Through all the years of their association, the fundamental absurdity of being paid by J. Jonah Jameson to provide evidence for J. Jonah Jameson's campaign against Spider-Man, of being simultaneously the photographer and the subject, the commercial asset and the editorial villain, the boy in the elevator, and the menace on the front page. Betty Brant was the first person in the Bugle's offices who treated Peter as something other than a vendor of a commercial product, and the warmth of that treatment, which was simply the warmth of ordinary professional courtesy, extended by someone with a naturally kind disposition, registered with a significance that said something about how little ordinary professional courtesy Peter had previously received. She was a few years older than him, with the self-possessed quality of someone who has had to manage real responsibilities from a young age, and has done so with enough grace to come out the other side capable of extending attention to other people, rather than being entirely consumed by their own experience. She asked him questions about his work that suggested genuine interest rather than social obligation, remembered details from previous conversations, occasionally offered observations about the news business that were wry and precise in a way that indicated she saw the Bugle and its operations with clearer eyes than her professional role required her to advertise. Their developing acquaintance was one of the few purely pleasant things in Peter's life during this period, uncomplicated by secret identity or heroic obligation or the specific grief that had reorganized so much else. A simple and warm exchange between two people who found each other's company agreeable and were not yet asking too much of it. He was aware that his feelings toward her were something more than professional regard, and something less than the kind of love that requires a future to sustain it, a warm appreciation for a specific person that was also, honestly, the appreciation of someone who had received so little uncomplicated kindness that even the ordinary variety was meaningful. The financial arithmetic of the Parker household was something Peter did in his head, with a regularity that had become automatic, the way certain kinds of long-term stress produce certain kinds of habitual calculation. May's medical expenses, which were not catastrophic but were not negligible, the mortgage on the Ingram Street house, the utility bills, the cost of food, the school expenses that Peter minimized where he could without letting May know he was minimizing them, the web fluid components that he purchased in small quantities from different suppliers to avoid creating a detectable purchasing pattern, all of it arranged itself into a sum that his Bugle income came close to meeting, and sometimes met and sometimes fell short of, by amounts that required the kind of creative management that was itself a form of ongoing low-grade anxiety. May did not talk to Peter about money directly, which was both an act of protection and a source of additional stress, because the protection required him to pretend not to notice things he noticed clearly. The slightly reduced quality of the groceries in the weeks when the numbers were tightest, the way she mended clothes that another household might have replaced, the particular pride she took in refusing every offer of assistance from neighbours who would have given it gladly and without condition. Her dignity was real, and Peter respected it completely, and it also made it harder to help her in direct ways, requiring him to find indirect ones, to arrange his bugle income as a contribution to household expenses that he framed as simply his fair share of the costs of living there, rather than as the economic lifeline it actually was. The nights belonged to Spider-Man, and the Spider-Man of those early months was a different figure than the one the city would eventually come to know, less assured and more improvisational, learning through error in real conditions rather than in any environment that allowed for the kind of controlled iteration his laboratory work permitted. He arrived too late to prevent things he had sensed coming. He misjudged distances in ways that were embarrassing and occasionally painful. He webbed innocent bystanders by accident in the general chaos of situations that were harder to read from within than they looked from outside. He caused property damage that he was not remotely in a position to compensate for, and that added, during those nights when it happened, a small additional weight to the general burden he was already carrying. But the learning was real, and it accumulated, and each mistake revised his understanding of something that abstract preparation could not have taught him. The specific hydrodynamics of a crowded street, the way that his spider sense required interpretation rather than simple obedience, because what it detected was the presence of danger rather than its precise nature or direction, the difference between the kind of situation that responded to direct intervention and the kind that required him to work from the edges rather than the centre. He kept notes on all of it in the private journal, the same one where he documented his abilities, adding now the documentation of their application, the field conditions that complicated them, the adjustments that improved them, the mistakes and the revised approaches, the slow accumulation of a practice. The double life that he was living had a texture that he would spend years trying to describe to himself accurately, because the usual language of duality, of two selves in conflict or in alternation, did not quite capture the experience from inside it. It was not that Peter Parker and Spider-Man were two different people who happened to share a body. It was more that they were two different aspects of the same person, each of which required the other to be complete, each of which was diminished without access to what the other provided. Peter Parker without Spider-Man was a boy with powers he could not use in the context where he spent most of his time, carrying knowledge he could not share and doing work that no one around him could acknowledge. Spider-Man without Peter Parker was a masked figure with no history, no loves, no domestic anchor, no one waiting at home who would notice if he did not return. What the double life cost him was less the energy of maintaining two separate presentations than the chronic loneliness of not being able to be fully present in either context. At school, he was distracted by what had happened the previous night, or what might happen that evening. On patrol, he was aware of May at home and the homework he had not finished, and the way Betty had looked when she said something in the bugle office that afternoon that he had wanted to respond to honestly but could not. The integration that might have made either life sustainable was not available to him, and he had not yet developed the specific emotional skill of living fully in the present moment, when the present moment was only one thread of something much more tangled, and so he was perpetually slightly somewhere else, slightly displaced from wherever he actually was, slightly out of register with whatever was immediately in front of him. This was the shape of his life in the years between Ben's death and the larger events that were coming. A shape that was not tragic in any acute sense, but that had its own particular weight. The weight of someone doing necessary work that no one could see, carrying necessary losses that no one could share, maintaining the discipline of a vow that drew its authority from a grief that had to be kept private, and finding, in the gaps between all of it, the small and genuine pleasures that kept the whole structure habitable. The problem of the web fluid solved at last, the clean arc of a web line through the pre-dawn light above an empty street, the careful warmth of May's house on Ingram Street, and occasionally, on the good days, the simple uncomplicated experience of having prevented something terrible from happening to someone who would go home that night without knowing how close it had come. There is a particular kind of education that cannot be acquired through books or laboratory work or any of the formal channels through which knowledge is supposed to flow, an education that arrives only through encounter, through the specific and sometimes violent experience of being tested by something that does not care about your preparation or your intentions, or the sincerity of your commitment to doing what is right. Peter had been educating himself in the laboratory of the city's nighttime streets for months, by the time the Rogues Gallery, as it would eventually come to be called, began to assemble itself around him, and the education those encounters provided was unlike anything his years at Midtown High or his private scientific reading had prepared him for, not because the villains he faced were simply dangerous, though they were, but because each of them held up a mirror of a specific and unsettling kind, reflecting back at him aspects of a world he was trying to protect and aspects of a self he was trying to understand, and the reflections were not always comfortable to look at directly. It is worth sitting with this for a moment. The idea that a hero's enemies are not merely obstacles between the hero and the world's safety, but are in some deeper sense participants in the hero's moral education. Characters in an ongoing argument about what power means and what it does to people and what the difference is, finally between someone who uses extraordinary ability in service of others and someone who uses it in service of themselves. Peter had made his choice on the waterfront the night Ben died, had oriented his compass and committed to the direction it pointed, but the choice made in the abstract, in grief and clarity, and the specific silence of a night that had taken everything comfortable away, is a different thing from the choice made again and again in the concrete and complicated presence of people who have made different choices and are willing to fight for them. The villains of his early years were the making of Spider-Man in this sense, not because they gave him something to fight, but because they gave him something to think about, something to measure himself against, something that illuminated, by contrast and by reflection, the specific shape of the heroism he was trying to embody. Otto Octavius was the first of them to lodge himself in Peter's understanding as something more than an adversary to be overcome, and the reason for this had everything to do with the particular nature of what Otto represented, which was not evil in the simple sense of the word, but something more specifically cautionary, more personally relevant to a boy whose greatest gift was also his most defining characteristic, and who had already had one lesson, at terrible cost, about what gifts unguided by conscience can become. Otto had been a brilliant man, genuinely and impressively brilliant, the kind of scientist whose contributions to the field of atomic research had been recognized by institutions and colleagues whose recognition was worth having. A man who had arrived at his professional position through the same combination of intellectual intensity and obsessive focus that Peter recognized in himself with an intimacy that was not comfortable. The difference between them was not talent. The difference was not even, at the beginning, character, because the young Otto Octavius had presumably been a person with the ordinary complement of human feeling and social connection, had presumably had people in his life who mattered to him and work that he believed in for reasons beyond the personal satisfaction it provided. The difference was what happened to Otto in the absence of those connections, what his brilliance became when it was no longer accountable to anything outside itself, when the arrogance that is perhaps an occupational hazard of exceptional intelligence was allowed to develop without the friction of genuine relationship or the moderating influence of caring what other people thought of him in a way that went beyond professional reputation. He had become, by the time the accident at the research facility fused his mechanical arms to his body and altered his neural chemistry in ways that amplified everything already present in his psychology, someone for whom other people existed primarily as audiences for his superiority or obstacles to his ambitions, someone whose relationships with the world around him had been reduced to the binary of dominance or irrelevance. The accident did not create this. The accident simply removed whatever remained of the inhibitions that had previously kept it from expressing itself at full volume. Peter's first encounter with Doctor Octopus was a defeat, unambiguous and educational in the way that only genuine defeats are educational, providing information about his own capabilities and limitations that no amount of successful performance could have supplied. Otto's 4 mechanical arms, each of them longer than a man, is tall and capable of exerting force that dwarfed even Peter's enhanced strength, moved with a speed and coordination that his spider sense could track, but that his body, in those early months of his career, could not yet respond to with the fluency the situation required. He had been outmatched, and he had retreated, and the experience of retreating had been humiliating in the way that things are humiliating, when they contradict a self-image one has been quietly constructing. The image of someone whose combination of powers and intelligence and moral commitment makes him equal to whatever the world places in front of him. But the defeat was also a lesson of a different and more important kind, because in studying Otto afterward, in trying to understand what he had encountered, and how to encounter it differently the next time, Peter found himself thinking not just about tactics, but about the person behind the mechanical arms, about what it meant that a man of Otto's intelligence had arrived at this particular destination, had made of his gift something that required a teenage boy in a homemade costume to come and stop him from harming people who had never done him any injury. The question that Doctor Octopus posed to Spider-Man was not merely tactical. It was the question of what brilliance is for, what it owes to the world that provided the conditions for its development, what it becomes when it decides that it owes nothing, and that the world exists for its benefit rather than the reverse. Peter knew this question personally. He had answered it one way and Otto had answered it another. And the difference between those answers was the difference between the person who showed up to stop the robbery and the person who was committing it. And sitting with that difference, really sitting with it, was part of what made him better at both the fighting and the thinking. The Vulture arrived in Peter's understanding of the city's dangers as a figure that produced in him, alongside the necessary practical response, something approaching the discomfort of recognition, not personal recognition exactly, but something adjacent to it, the recognition of a pattern he had seen before in a different register. Adrian Toombs was old, genuinely old, a man who'd been building things and working and contributing to the world for decades, and who had arrived at the later portion of his life with the conviction that the world owed him more than it had paid, that his intelligence and his years and his contributions had entitled him to a recognition and a prosperity that had been withheld through the dishonesty or indifference of other people, and that the appropriate response to this injustice was to take what he was owed by whatever means the electromagnetic harness he had invented made available to him. There was something in Toombs's psychology that Peter understood better than he would have liked to, not because he shared it, but because he could trace its architecture with the clarity of someone who has himself felt the specific frustration of being overlooked and undervalued, of bringing genuine ability to a world that does not notice or reward it with any consistency. The difference between Peter's response to that experience and Adrian Toombs's response was not a difference in the feeling, but in what was done with the feeling, whether the frustration of invisibility became the engine of a commitment to making things better, or whether it curdled into resentment and the conviction that the only honest response to a world that does not see you is to take from it what it has withheld. Peter had, in Ben Parker, someone who modelled the first kind of response so thoroughly and so consistently that it had become the default of his own moral imagination. Toombs had apparently not had this, or had had it, and lost it somewhere along the way, and the result was a man who flew through the city on stolen electromagnetic power, and took what he wanted from people who had never considered that the bitter old man they had overlooked might one day decide to stop accepting his invisibility quietly. The battles with the Vulture were among the more physically demanding of Peter's early career, because Toombs in flight had a three-dimensional mobility that translated poorly to the confined spaces where most street-level confrontations occurred, and that required Peter to develop new approaches to aerial pursuit and engagement that his web-swinging skills, still being refined during this period, were not yet fully equipped to support. But they were also among the more psychologically interesting, because Toombs fought with a fury that was not simply criminal ambition, was instead something personal and grieving beneath its aggression, the fury of someone who believes they have been wronged in a way that no individual action can adequately address, who has decided that the whole world is the appropriate target for an anger that originally had a more specific source. Peter could not fix what had made Adrian Toombs who he was. He could only stop him from doing the things that who he was led him to do, and this limitation, the limitation of addressing symptoms rather than causes, would become one of the abiding frustrations of his heroic career. Maxwell Dillon, the man who became Electro, offered a different kind of reflection, one that required less sympathy and more careful thought, because Dillon's transformation from an ordinary electrical lineman into someone capable of generating and projecting electrical current at levels that made him genuinely dangerous had not required the decades of corrosive resentment that had produced the Vulture, or the professional arrogance that had preceded Doctor Octopus's accident. It had required only the accident itself. The freakish incident of a lightning strike during a moment of contact with high-voltage equipment, and the immediate decision, made apparently without significant deliberation, that this new power was an opportunity for personal enrichment, rather than an experience that carried any kind of responsibility. Dillon had not been a particularly bad man before his transformation. He had not been a particularly good one either, had been instead the kind of person who exists in the large middle category of people who behave reasonably well when the cost of behaving badly is high, and who can be expected to make worse choices when the cost decreases significantly. What Electro represented to Peter's developing moral imagination was the clearest possible illustration of the proposition that powers without values are simply amplified versions of whatever values were already present, that the spider bite had not created in him a heroic instinct that had not previously existed, but had instead magnified and given practical expression to instincts that were already there, instincts planted by Ben and a May, and the specific quality of a childhood that, whatever its loneliness, had been rich in moral example. Dylan had been magnified in the same way, and had produced something entirely different, because the raw material was different, because the values that were amplified were the ordinary values of someone who had never been asked to think seriously about obligation, or responsibility, or the relationship between what you can do and what you should do. The spider bite and the lightning strike were formally similar events. Their outcomes were not, and the difference lived entirely in the person who received them. The cases that stayed with Peter longest from this period were not the ones that were most dangerous, but the ones that were most complicated, and among the most complicated was the ongoing situation with Curtis Connors, the scientist who became the lizard, because Connors was not a villain in any of the senses that Peter could apply to the others, was instead a good man who had made a terrible mistake in pursuit of a genuinely good goal, and who was paying for that mistake in a way that implicated Peter's sense of justice, in ways that Fighting Tombs or Dylan or even Otto did not. Connors had lost his right arm in military service, and had devoted his subsequent scientific career to the problem of human tissue regeneration, driven by the specific and generous motivation of wanting to help other people who had experienced similar losses, wanting to give back to the world something of what the world's violence had taken from them. His research into reptilian regenerative biology was serious and peer-reviewed and aimed at outcomes that would have been genuinely valuable to medicine and to human welfare. The formula he developed worked in the sense that it restored his missing arm, and also in another sense that he had not intended and could not control, transforming his entire physiology in ways that went far beyond the regeneration of lost tissue, replacing the human architecture of his mind and body with something that was both more and less than what he had been, more physically powerful and less capable of the specifically human forms of reasoning and restraint that distinguish the actions of persons from the actions of animals. The lizard that Connors became under the formula's influence was not Curtis Connors making bad choices. It was something that had overwritten Curtis Connors while he watched helplessly from somewhere inside the altered chemistry of his own brain, and the horror of that experience, the experience of being present while something else inhabits your body and does things in your name that you would not do, was something that Peter found himself thinking about with a care and a seriousness that went well beyond the tactical requirements of stopping the creature's immediate activities. Because stopping the lizard was always, in Peter's understanding of the situation, the wrong frame for what he was actually trying to do when he encountered Connors in his transformed state. What he was trying to do was find Curtis Connors inside the transformation and give him a path back, restore to a good man the human form in which his goodness could be expressed, undo a mistake that had been made in service of something admirable, without the mistake negating the admiration. This required a different kind of heroism than Fighting Tombs or Dylan required scientific problem-solving alongside physical intervention, required holding in mind simultaneously the necessity of stopping the immediate harm and the importance of treating the person responsible for that harm as a victim, rather than simply as an antagonist. It was the kind of complexity that Peter had not anticipated when he made his vow on the waterfront. The discovery that protecting people sometimes means protecting people from each other, and sometimes means protecting them from themselves, and occasionally means protecting them from the outcomes of their own best intentions. The Sandman, Flint Marko, complicated things in a different direction, offering the figure of a man who was genuinely criminal in his history and his choices, but who was also, in ways that emerged gradually through Peter's encounters with him, something more than the history and those choices contained. A person whose capacity for feeling existed in genuine tension with his capacity for harm, and who occasionally, in the gaps between one and the other, demonstrated a quality of longing for a different kind of life that was too real to dismiss and too insubstantial to act on in any sustainable way. Marko had become the Sandman through the same general mechanism as Dylan, a freak accident of physics during a period of flight from law enforcement, and his sandy metamorphosis had given him abilities that made conventional containment nearly impossible, while doing nothing to resolve the underlying conditions, the poverty, the limited options, the specific damage of a childhood and a young adulthood that had offered him very few models of any other way of being, that had produced in him a person for whom crime was less a choice than a grammar, the available language for navigating a world that had never offered him the vocabulary of legitimate aspiration. Peter fought the Sandman many times in those early years and never felt, after any of those encounters, the clean satisfaction of having resolved something, because the thing that needed to be resolved was not available to resolution through the means he had available. He could stop Marco from doing a specific thing in a specific place on a specific night. He could not stop the conditions that made Marco who he was, could not undo the childhood or provide the opportunities or address the systemic realities that had made this particular path seem like the available one. This limitation was not unique to the Sandman, was in fact a limitation that the entire project of street-level heroism runs into constantly and unavoidably. But Marco's case made it peculiarly vivid, because the man's occasional expressions of regret or longing were specific and believable enough to make the limitation feel personal rather than merely structural. What the rogues gallery of those early years gave Peter, taken together and understood as a whole, rather than as a series of discrete encounters, was a graduate education in the moral complexity of the world he'd committed to protecting, a complexity that the simple clarity of his vow had not fully prepared him for. The world did not divide cleanly into people who deserved protection and people who deserved stopping. It contained people who were both simultaneously, people who caused harm because harm had been done to them, people who used their gifts destructively because no one had ever shown them that gifts carry obligations, people who were trapped inside transformations they had not chosen and could not control, people who had made choices that led them somewhere they had not intended to go and who could not find the way back without help that the conventional options did not provide. Spider-Man could address the immediate and specific expressions of all of this. He could not address the whole of it, and learning to act effectively within that limitation, to do the possible good without being paralyzed by the impossible remainder, was one of the most difficult and most necessary things the early years of his career taught him to do. He carried all of it with him, the victories and the defeats, the tactical lessons and the moral ones, the faces of the men he had fought, and the specific understanding of what each of those faces reflected about the world and about himself. And he carried it not as a burden that accumulated toward some breaking point, but as a kind of ballast, weight that kept the ship of his commitment stable in conditions that might otherwise have capsized it. He was still very young. He was still learning what heroism actually required, as distinct from what he had imagined it would require in the waterfront clarity of that first terrible night. And the Rogues Gallery, taken in its entirety, was part of the education, the world's way of showing him that the thing he had committed to was larger and stranger, and more demanding than he had understood, and that the demand was not a reason to stop but a reason to think harder, care more, and keep going. Norman Osborn entered Peter's awareness gradually and then all at once, the way that certain kinds of danger do, present at the edges of the picture, for long enough that the mind begins to accommodate its presence before the nature of the threat has been fully understood, and by the time the full understanding arrives, the accommodation has already created a vulnerability that directness might have prevented. Peter had known Norman through Harry before he knew him in any other context, had encountered him first as the background fact of his closest friend's life, the father who was always elsewhere, always occupied with something more pressing than the specific human being who happened to be his son, whose presence in the Osborn household was felt most strongly in his absences and in the specific quality of anxious anticipation with which Harry awaited his occasional appearances. Norman Osborn, as a figure in the world of New York business and industry, was a man of genuine and considerable achievement, and this was important to understand about him, because the easy version of his story, the version that reduces him simply to the monster he eventually became, misses something essential about the specific kind of corruption that his story represents, which is not the corruption of someone who was always monstrous and finally found the means to express it, but the corruption of someone who had real gifts and real accomplishments, and who had made, somewhere along the way, a series of choices about what those gifts and accomplishments were, for that led, with a logic that was not inevitable but was in retrospect comprehensible, to somewhere very dark. He had built Oscorp Industries from a smaller enterprise into one of New York's most significant chemical and manufacturing concerns through a combination of genuine scientific intelligence, extraordinary business acumen, and a willingness to pursue profitable opportunities with a thoroughness that did not always pause to ask whether profitable and ethical occupied the same territory in the specific case at hand. This need existed in him as a pressure, building over years of accomplishment that were never quite sufficient to the ego they were supposed to satisfy, and the pressure required, eventually, an outlet. The experimental formula that Norman was developing in the restricted laboratories of Oscorp in the period leading up to the accident was, by his own account and by the account of the researchers who worked under him, genuinely innovative work, an attempt to create a chemical compound that would enhance human physical and cognitive performance through a process of selective biochemical stimulation that went significantly beyond anything previously attempted in the field. The commercial applications he envisioned for such a compound were extensive and lucrative, but the more immediate application, the one that drove the pace of the work and the willingness to accept risks that a more cautious researcher would have declined, was personal. Norman intended to use the formula on himself, to become, through chemical means, the superior being that his need for supremacy required him to be, to resolve the gap between what he was and what he believed he deserved to be through the directest available method. The explosion that occurred in the restricted laboratory on the evening when Norman was conducting what was intended to be a preliminary self-administered test of the formula's effects was the kind of industrial accident that, examined afterward, reveals a chain of compounding errors, each of which was individually insufficient to cause catastrophe, and all of which together made it inevitable. The formula that bathed him in the explosion's aftermath was not the formula as designed, had been altered by the heat and pressure of the explosion in ways that changed its biochemical profile in directions that the original design had not intended, and that no one, in the chaos of the immediate aftermath, was in a position to analyze or predict. Norman survived the explosion with his physical body more or less intact, with his intelligence and his ambition, and his capacity for planning all similarly undamaged, and with something else present now that had not been there before, something that the explosion's chemistry had either created or uncovered, a version of himself that was not constrained by the inhibitions and the accommodations and the careful social performances that the public Norman Osborn had spent a lifetime constructing and maintaining. The Green Goblin did not appear immediately. He assembled himself over time in the spaces between Norman's public life, in the late hours of the Oscorp executive suite and the private rooms of the Osborn mansion, in the gradual accumulation of resources and plans and a technical apparatus, the glider, the weapons, the costume with its grotesque and deliberate theatricality, that served the Goblin's purposes with a precision that reflected the genuine engineering intelligence of the man who had designed them. The pumpkin bombs were not the improvised weapons of someone acting on impulse, but the carefully engineered products of serious materials, science applied to the problem of creating maximum psychological impact alongside their physical effects, designed to disorient and terrify as much as to injure, chosen to communicate something specific about their creator's understanding of himself and his relationship to the world he was now moving through in a new and unaccommodating way. Peter's first encounters with the Green Goblin produced in him a quality of unease that was different from what the other members of his rogues gallery had produced, and he spent some time in the aftermath of those early confrontations trying to understand precisely what the difference was, because understanding it felt important in a way that went beyond the immediate tactical question of how to fight someone with a flying glider and a seemingly inexhaustible supply of exotic weapons. What he eventually identified was that the Goblin fought without the usual legibility of motive that even the most dangerous of his other enemies possessed, that Toombs and Dillon and Otto all wanted things that Peter could understand and therefore anticipate, wealth or power or the demonstration of superiority in forms that were recognizable as distorted versions of ordinary human desires, while the Goblin seemed to want something different and harder to name, something that had less to do with specific outcomes than with the experience of the conflict itself, with the pleasure of a particular kind of engagement that required an opponent worthy of it. This was, Peter gradually understood, because the Goblin was not simply a criminal using exotic means to pursue criminal ends, but something that more resembled a predator in the specific sense of a creature that defines itself through the quality of what it hunts, and the quality of opponent that the Goblin required for this self-definition was not available in the ordinary criminal landscape of New York City, was available only in someone who could actually match him, who had the combination of intelligence and physical capability and moral commitment that made the conflict meaningful rather than merely overwhelming. Spider-Man was not simply an obstacle between the Green Goblin and his goals. Spider-Man was the goal. The specific adversary whose existence gave the Goblin's existence its shape and its purpose, and this made their relationship a different kind of thing from the relationships Peter had with his other enemies, more intimate and more dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with the physical capabilities of either party. The escalating campaign that the Goblin conducted against Spider-Man over the months that followed their first encounters was remarkable for the intelligence it demonstrated, the patience with which the Goblin built his understanding of his opponent's capabilities and limitations, the creativity with which he designed situations that were calculated to reveal weaknesses that straightforward confrontation would not have exposed. He studied Spider-Man the way a scientist studies a subject of genuine interest, with the investment of someone who cares about accuracy rather than simply about outcome, and the profile he was constructing through this study was both tactical and psychological, an assessment not just of what Spider-Man could do but of what he cared about, what he was unwilling to risk, what he would sacrifice his own safety to protect. This information would eventually become the most dangerous weapon in the Goblin's arsenal, more dangerous than any of his technical inventions, because it pointed directly at the one vulnerability that Peter's powers could not address. The discovery of Peter's secret identity was not a single dramatic moment of revelation, but the culmination of an investigation that Norman had been conducting with the methodical thoroughness of someone who has significant resources and is willing to deploy them patiently toward a conclusion he is confident of reaching. Corporate databases, private investigators, surveillance equipment, and his own considerable analytical intelligence were all brought to bear on the question of who was beneath the Spider-Man mask, and the answer, when the investigation arrived at it, produced in Norman a reaction that was not simply the satisfaction of a question answered, but something more complex and more personal, a sense of having been specifically and individually betrayed that added a dimension to his hatred of Spider-Man that had not previously been present. Harry's best friend, the boy who had sat at the Osborn dinner table and accepted Norman's hospitality, and conducted himself with a diffidence and a modesty that Norman had privately considered a kind of weakness, the boy who was too smart for his own good and too awkward for normal society, the boy whose ordinariness had made him an acceptable companion for Harry, precisely because he seemed to pose no threat to anything Norman valued, was the masked vigilante who had repeatedly humiliated him, who had stood between the Green Goblin and every objective he had pursued, who had made a mockery of the intelligence and the power and the carefully assembled technical superiority that were supposed to make Norman Osborn invincible. The discovery was not merely information, it was a wound, and wounds of that particular kind, wounds to the pride of someone whose entire psychological architecture is organized around the premise of their own superiority, do not heal in any ordinary way. The confrontation in which Norman revealed his knowledge of Peter's identity took place in the familiar geography of Peter's own neighborhood, the specific violation of that choice calculated and deliberate, the Goblin arriving not at some neutral location or dramatic landmark but at the place where Peter Parker lived as Peter Parker, where May's garden grew in the backyard and the photographs sat on every surface, and the smell of the house was the smell of everything Ben had been, and everything Peter was trying to honor. The Green Goblin knew where Peter Parker lived because Norman Osborn had made it his business to know, and the arrival of the Goblin in that context was a statement about the completeness of his knowledge, about how thoroughly the boundary between Peter's two lives had been dissolved by the investigation that Norman's resources had made possible. What followed was a battle in which both combatants were fighting with an intensity that reflected how much more was at stake than their previous encounters had involved. Peter because the threat was now to everything he loved, and not merely to himself. Norman because this felt like the decisive engagement, the one in which the question of who was truly superior would finally be answered without the ambiguity that previous confrontations had left. The physical conflict moved through the neighborhood with a destructiveness that Peter was simultaneously trying to minimize, aware of the houses nearby and the people inside them, while Norman had no such concern, and the asymmetry of those priorities created tactical disadvantages that required constant improvisation to manage. The explosion that ended the confrontation and left Norman unconscious on the ground of his own making was followed by the thing that Peter had not anticipated, and that made the resolution of the situation so much more complicated than a simple villain defeated and delivered to justice would have been. When he reached Norman and checked his condition, it was immediately clear that something had changed in the man's neurological state, that the explosion and its accompanying shock had produced a disruption of some kind in the chemical architecture that had been sustaining the goblin persona, and as Peter watched, uncertain of what he was witnessing, Norman Osborn's face underwent a change that was not physical, but was somehow entirely visible. A shift in its quality and expression that suggested the withdrawal of something that had been present, and the tentative return of something that had been absent. Norman looked at him without recognition. Not the deliberate non-recognition of someone choosing not to acknowledge what they know, but the genuine absence of recognition, the face of someone for whom the recent past has been erased, and who is trying to locate himself in a present that makes no immediate sense. He did not know who Spider-Man was. He did not know what the Green Goblin was. He did not, it appeared, have access to any of the memories that had accumulated in the months of the Goblin's existence, the planning and the investigations and the confrontations and the terrible intimate knowledge of Peter Parker's private life. He was simply Norman Osborn, the industrialist, confused and injured on a street in Queens, without any apparent understanding of how he had come to be there. Peter made the choice that he would spend years second-guessing, and that he would never finally regret in a simple, uncomplicated way, but that he also could not entirely justify in terms that satisfied every part of his moral understanding. He left Norman there for the paramedics rather than the police. He said nothing about what he knew. He allowed the public record to reflect nothing more than an explosion of uncertain origin and a businessman found unconscious in its aftermath. And he allowed Harry to bring his father home from the hospital and to receive back a version of his father that was, outwardly and behaviourally, the version Harry had always wanted, present and coherent and unburdened by whatever had been driving the increasingly erratic behaviour of the preceding months. The weight of the secret that Peter now carried was different from the weight of his original secret identity. It was heavier in some ways and differently distributed, because it was not simply a secret about himself, but a secret about someone else, someone whose capacity for destruction he had witnessed directly, and whose proximity to Harry and to the edges of Peter's own personal life made the carrying of that secret feel like a constant low-grade responsibility, an ongoing obligation of vigilance that had no clear endpoint and no clean resolution. He told himself that Norman might genuinely have changed, that the chemical disruption might have addressed whatever the formula had done to his psychology, that the man who had returned from the hospital was the real Norman Osborn rather than a temporary version of him waiting for the right conditions to give way again to the other one. He told himself this with the sincerity of someone who genuinely wants to believe something, and the awareness of someone who is not entirely sure they do. What he knew, and what he had to live with knowing, was that somewhere beneath the surface of the respectable industrialist who attended Oscorp board meetings and occasionally appeared at his son's college in the capacity of a father making an effort, there was knowledge that matched his own, knowledge of Peter Parker's face beneath Spider-Man's mask, of the house on Ingram Street and the photographs on every surface, and May's garden in the backyard. Knowledge that had been chemically sealed rather than genuinely erased, and that might therefore be chemically recovered under the right or wrong conditions. He carried this awareness into every subsequent interaction with the Osborn family, into every dinner he shared with Harry, and every occasion when Norman's name came up in conversation, a background radiation of knowing that could not be switched off, and that coloured everything it touched with a quality of provisional safety, the safety of someone who understands that what is currently still might not always remain so. There are people who arrive in a life and immediately clarify something about it, not through any dramatic gesture or declaration, but simply through the quality of their presence, the specific way they occupy a room, or a conversation, or a shared afternoon, that makes the life feel more coherent and more purposeful than it did before they were in it, as though their arrival has tuned something that was slightly out of register, without the person knowing it was out of register, until the adjustment has been made. Gwen Stacy arrived in Peter Parker's life this way. Not dramatically, not at a moment of crisis or transformation, but quietly and with the specific naturalness of someone whose personality does not require a particular set of conditions in order to be fully itself, who is simply and completely who they are in whatever circumstances present themselves, and the effect of this on Peter, who had spent so much of his life managing the distance between what he was on the outside and what he was on the inside was something that he did not fully understand until he found himself, in her company, slightly less exhausted than usual by the effort of being himself. Empire State University presented itself to Peter in the autumn of his first year there as a different kind of world from Midtown High, larger and more various and organized around different principles, a place where the social hierarchies that had made his adolescence so consistently uncomfortable were not exactly absent but were configured differently, less rigid and less universally enforced, structured around departments and research groups and the loose affiliations of people who shared intellectual interests rather than around the athletic and social dominance games that had governed the smaller and more claustrophobic world of high school. He was not immediately comfortable there, because comfort was not something Peter came to easily or quickly in any new environment, but he was not immediately miserable either, which was an improvement, and the science facilities were everything he had hoped they would be. Laboratories and equipment that made his bedroom experiments feel appropriately preliminary, the infrastructure of serious scientific work available to him in a way that created a specific and uncomplicated pleasure that he could simply have without guilt or qualification. Harry Osborn was already there when Peter arrived, already navigating the university's social landscape with the ease of someone for whom social landscapes have never presented serious difficulty, his family's wealth and his own natural warmth making him immediately visible and immediately liked in the way of people who expect to be liked, and who carry that expectation so naturally that it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling social logic. Their friendship, which had begun in the particular circumstances of Harry's need for genuine connection, and Peter's need for almost any connection at all, had survived the transition from high school to university in a form that was recognisably continuous with what it had been but also subtly different, shaped by the different context and by the ways that both of them had changed. Harry's generosity deepening into something more self-aware and less reflexively performed, Peter's guardedness softening slightly in the presence of someone who had consistently demonstrated that his interest in Peter was not contingent on Peter being anything other than what he was. Gwen was in his physics seminar, which Peter learned on the first day of the semester, when he arrived slightly late and found a seat near the back of the room and spent the first few minutes of the professor's introduction looking around at his new classmates with the habit of careful observation that had always been one of his primary modes of encountering new environments. She was sitting 2 rows ahead of him and slightly to the left, and what he noticed first was not her appearance but the quality of her attention, the specific way she was listening to the professor, not the performed attention of someone demonstrating their engagement, but the real thing. The particular stillness of someone who is genuinely interested in what is being said, and is devoting their full cognitive capacity to following it. He recognized this quality because it was his own quality, and he encountered it rarely enough in other people that its presence was immediately notable. She was the daughter of a police captain, he learned through the general information exchange of early semester introductions, a fact that he filed away with the instinctive alertness he brought to any information that touched on the relationship between his two lives, assessing it for the specific kind of complication it might represent, before concluding that a police captain's daughter at Empire State University was not, on its own, a reason for the particular vigilance he brought to most information about law enforcement. Her father, Captain George Stacy, was a name he had encountered in the context of his Spider-Man activities, attached to a reputation for the kind of principled and intelligent police work that made the good officers distinguishable from the ones who simply occupied the role, and this information, when he eventually connected it to the woman in his physics seminar, added a dimension to his interest in her that was part wariness and part, if he was honest with himself, something closer to the admiration he might feel toward anyone whose family background included genuine integrity. Their first real conversation happened after the third week's seminar, in the corridor outside the classroom, both of them having lingered over the same point in the professor's lecture that had struck them as insufficiently supported by the available evidence, and the conversation that began as a shared technical observation expanded naturally into something broader and warmer, the kind of conversation that happens when two people who think similarly discover each other's existence and recognize immediately the particular pleasure of not having to explain themselves. Peter was not unaware of the irony that his best conversations happened when he was being most genuinely himself, most fully Peter Parker the scientist and the careful thinker, when the Spider-Man part of his life was furthest from the surface, and there was something bittersweet in recognizing that the self that other people found most engaging was the self he was least able to fully offer them. Given everything that the other self required, Gwen's intelligence was not the kind that announces itself or seeks recognition, was instead the working kind, the kind that is interested in problems rather than in being known as someone who solves them, and this quality made her company consistently invigorating in a way that had nothing to do with performance or impression management, and everything to do with the genuine exchange of two minds that were genuinely engaged with the same questions. She was also kind in a way that was specific rather than general, attentive to the particular person in front of her rather than simply disposed toward humanity in the abstract, and this specificity of kindness, the way she noticed things about people and responded to what she actually noticed rather than to a generalized idea of what they might need, was something Peter found both deeply appealing and slightly unnerving, because a person who pays that quality of attention is harder to be partially present with than a person who is satisfied with the surface. He was partially present with almost everyone in his life, by necessity and by habit, the Spider-Man part of his existence requiring a constant allocation of attention and energy that was not available for complete investment in the immediate human interaction, and he had become skilled, over the years of managing his double life, at creating the impression of full presence, while actually maintaining a significant interior reserve for monitoring his spider sense and assessing the environment, and tracking the dozen other variables that a person with his responsibilities had to track simultaneously. With Gwen, this was harder than with most people, not because she demanded more explicitly, but because the quality of her attention seemed to call out for a matching quality in return, seemed to make the reservation of that interior space feel like a specific discourtesy, rather than simply a practical necessity. Captain George Stacy entered Peter's life as something that surprised him by arriving without the complication he had anticipated, presenting himself not as a law enforcement figure with the ambivalent relationship to Spider-Man that most of the department embodied, but as something considerably simpler and considerably more welcome. A man of genuine intelligence and moral seriousness who had thought carefully about the relationship between official law enforcement and the city's costumed heroes and had arrived at conclusions that were generous without being naive. Peter encountered him first at a faculty social event where Gwen had invited him, Captain Stacy arriving with the particular presence of someone who has spent decades in situations that required the management of other people's anxiety and has developed thereby a quality of steadiness that is calming rather than merely authoritative. Their conversations over the weeks and months that followed had a quality that Peter recognized from his relationship with Ben, the quality of talking with someone whose moral seriousness matched his own, and whose life experience gave him access to perspectives that Peter's youth and the specific limitations of his heroic vantage point had not yet provided him. Captain Stacy talked about justice with the precision of someone who had spent a career navigating the gap between justice as an ideal and justice as a practical and often compromised institutional reality, who had learned to work within systems he did not entirely trust in service of outcomes he genuinely believed in. And the specific wisdom this produced was different from Ben's wisdom in its content, but similar in its quality, the wisdom of someone who had chosen difficulty over comfort and had been changed, not damaged but refined, by that choice. Peter did not know how much Stacy knew about Spider-Man, or suspected about Spider-Man, or had deduced about Spider-Man through the combination of his professional training and his evident intelligence, and this uncertainty was something he managed by being slightly more careful in Stacy's presence than he was with other people, slightly more attentive to the moments when a response might reveal more than he intended. What he could not manage was the specific warmth he felt toward the man, which was genuine and grew over time, and which carried with it the particular vulnerability of caring about someone whose professional world intersected with his heroic one in ways that created risks he tried not to think about too directly. The relationship between Peter and Gwen developed with the gradual and somewhat halting pace of something being built between two people who are both, for different reasons, somewhat cautious about the process of being known. Gwen's caution came from intelligence and from the self-possession of someone who understands their own worth and is not interested in offering it cheaply or without appropriate reciprocity. Peter's caution came from the architecture of his double life and the specific problem that had characterized every close relationship he had attempted since gaining his powers, the problem that genuine intimacy requires a completeness of presence and a willingness to be known that his secret identity made structurally impossible in the most important dimension. He liked her very much, and this liking was something he handled with the care of someone who understands that what they are handling is fragile and valuable and at risk from the specific conditions of the environment they are operating in. He was funny with her in a way that he was not always able to be funny, his natural wit finding a receptive audience in someone quick enough to catch what he was actually doing with language rather than simply what he was literally saying. He was serious with her in a way that was also, for the same reason, uncomplicated. The intellectual seriousness that was the deepest register of his personality finding a natural counterpart in hers. He was, in her company, closer to the entirety of himself than he was able to be in most contexts, and this proximity to his own wholeness, the brief and precious experience of not having to manage the distance between his different selves, was something he recognized as rare and therefore precious, and therefore, in the logic of his particular situation, somewhat terrifying. What he could not be with her was complete. The completeness that she deserved, that any genuine relationship required, was not available to him as long as the central fact of his life was something he could not share, and he was aware of this incompleteness in their developing relationship as a structural reality that no amount of warmth or humour or shared intellectual pleasure could fully address. He told himself that he was protecting her, which was true, and he told himself that he was protecting himself, which was also true, and underneath both of these he was aware of a third truth that was harder to name, which was that he had not yet found a way to believe that someone could know the whole of what he was and choose to stay, and this disbelief, which had nothing to do with Gwen specifically, and everything to do with the accumulated experience of being someone whose most important dimension was hidden from everyone who loved him, was its own kind of barrier, perhaps the most fundamental one. Their relationship had arrived at something that both of them recognized, without naming it directly, as significant and ongoing, and likely to continue deepening when Captain Stacy died. The battle with Doctor Octopus that preceded his death was one of the larger and more destructive confrontations that Peter had been involved in during those years, taking place across several blocks of Midtown Manhattan, with the particular chaos that Otto's mechanical arms produced in urban environments, the structural damage and the scatter of debris, and the difficulty of controlling the scope of a conflict when one of the participants had no investment in limiting the collateral consequences. Peter had been managing the situation with the divided attention that such situations required, keeping track of civilians in the immediate area while simultaneously dealing with Otto's arms and trying to maneuver toward a resolution that would stop the confrontation without the extended property destruction that a prolonged engagement in a populated area inevitably produced. Captain Stacy was present because he was always present when situations of this scale developed in his precinct, because the kind of officer he was did not manage serious incidents from a distance, and did not consider the personal risk entailed by proximity to be a relevant consideration when measured against the professional obligation to be where his judgment and his authority were most needed. Peter was aware of him at the edge of the engagement, coordinating the police perimeter, directing civilians away from the most dangerous areas with the quiet efficiency of someone who has done this many times and has reduced it to a kind of professional fluency. He was grateful for Stacy's presence in the way he was always grateful when law enforcement on the scene understood what Spider-Man was trying to do and worked with rather than against him. The piece of masonry that fell from the building Otto's arms had compromised came loose in a way that Peter's spider sense registered a fraction of a second too late to allow him to intercept it, before it had already created the situation that Captain Stacy was already responding to. A child separated from the adults who had been trying to move her away from the danger area, standing in the path of the falling debris, with the particular stillness of a very young child who's been overwhelmed by the scale of the situation around her and has stopped moving as a result. Stacy was already moving before Peter could redirect himself, already crossing the distance between himself and the child, with the decisive speed of someone who has made a decision and is not revisiting it. And he pushed her clear of the debris path and took the impact himself, in the way that people who put themselves between danger and others sometimes do, completely and without the possibility of a partial outcome. Peter reached him before most others did, and what he found was the specific human reality of a man who had been seriously injured, and who knew it, and who was, nevertheless, in the moments he had, organizing what remained of his consciousness around what mattered most, rather than around the pain or the fear. Stacy looked at him, at the mask that covered his face, and there was in his expression something that Peter had not expected and could not immediately process. A quality of recognition that went beyond the general recognition of Spider-Man as a known presence, and that felt instead like the recognition of something specific and particular and long confirmed. He said Peter's name. Not Spider-Man's name, Peter's name. And what moved through Peter at the sound of it was not the panic of exposure, but something more complex and more quietly devastating. The recognition that a man he loved had known a truth he had been protecting and had chosen to carry that knowledge with dignity and discretion, and without using it in any way other than to see him more completely. His last words were about Gwen, about the care that she would need, about the trust he was placing in Peter to provide that care in the ways that only someone who genuinely loved her could provide. And in those words was the complete expression of a father who had understood his daughter's heart, and understood the heart of the young man who occupied it, and was using the last of himself to connect those two understandings in a way that might, with time, make something sustaining out of what was about to become something devastating. Peter held him until the paramedics arrived, and the weight of him, the specific human weight of a good man who had lived as though goodness was not merely an aspiration but a practice, was something Peter carried in his arms and then carried in his memory for all the years that followed. Present in every subsequent understanding he had of what it meant to be trusted and what it meant to be seen. Gwen's grief was the grief of someone who had loved her father without reservation, and who had lost him in a context that the newspapers the next morning, shaped largely by Jonah Jameson's editorial machinery, presented as the direct consequence of Spider-Man's presence at the scene, the narrative of a reckless vigilante whose activities created the conditions for innocent people to be hurt now having, in the death of a respected police captain, its most powerful and most damaging example. She did not arrive at this conclusion immediately or completely, because Gwen Stacy was too intelligent and too honest to accept any narrative without testing it against what she actually knew and observed. But grief is not an environment in which intelligence and honesty operate at full capacity, and the need to place the devastation somewhere, to give it an address rather than allow it to be simply the formless and unbearable fact of absence, was a need that the available narrative satisfied in ways that the more complicated truth could not. Peter could not defend Spider-Man to her without revealing what defending Spider-Man cost him to do, and so he absorbed the distance that her anger created with the specific helplessness of someone watching harm arrive that they cannot prevent without causing a different and equally serious harm. He sat with her in her grief, and he said the true things he was able to say, that her father had been a remarkable man, that his loss was real and serious and deserved to be mourned without qualification, that the love she had for him was one of the most clearly legible things Peter had ever witnessed in another person, and that it was, whatever else, evidence of how much she had been given in having him for as long as she had. He did not say the things he could not say. He held the space between them where the complete truth would have gone and let it remain empty because emptiness was less damaging than the alternatives he had available, and he felt the gap between them widen with each week that her grief, amplified by the public narrative about Spider-Man, settled into something harder and less porous than the fresh devastation of the immediate aftermath. There is a particular loneliness in loving someone from a position of partial concealment, in being the person they turn to for comfort while also being, unknown to them, connected to the source of their pain. Peter carried this loneliness through the months that followed Captain Stacy's death, with the same patient endurance he brought to all the other things he carried, not without cost but without collapse, because collapse was not available to him any more than laying his burdens down was available to him, and because the alternative to carrying them was abandoning people who needed him to keep going, which was the one thing he had promised himself, on a waterfront in Queens what felt like a lifetime ago, that he would never do. The memories came back to Norman Osborn the way certain kinds of damage return to structures that have been weakened rather than repaired, not all at once, and not in the form of a single dramatic restoration, but incrementally, in the manner of a foundation that has been cracked rather than broken, and that yields to pressure gradually rather than collapsing under it. Each small surrender making the next one slightly more likely until the cumulative effect of many small failures produces something that looks, from the outside, like a sudden catastrophe, but that has in fact been developing quietly for a long time, in the spaces where the damage was never properly addressed. The chemical amnesia that had sealed his memories of the Green Goblin period had never been, in any medical sense, a healing. It had been a suppression, a pressure applied from the outside to something that continued to exist inside, and the conditions that had made the suppression possible, the specific neurochemical equilibrium that the explosion had inadvertently produced, were themselves unstable and subject to erosion under the pressures of stress and time and the particular chemical environment of a brain that had been significantly altered and had never returned to what it was before the accident in the Oscorp laboratory. Norman had returned to his life with the earnest and somewhat bewildered quality of someone who knows they have lost time and cannot account for it, who is aware of a gap in their experience that the people around them can see and are being careful not to discuss too directly. He ran Oscorp. He attended dinners. He appeared, occasionally and with the slightly effortful quality of someone performing a role they have not yet fully inhabited, at Harry's college in the capacity of a father. Peter watched him during these appearances with the specific vigilance of someone who is tracking a variable that everyone else believes to have been resolved, and what he saw was for a long time simply Norman Osborn being Norman Osborn, ambitious and demanding and fundamentally indifferent to most human beings in the specific way of people for whom other people are primarily instrumental, but nothing more than this, nothing that crossed the threshold into the territory that Peter was most afraid of. The erosion, when it began, expressed itself first in things that might have been attributed to ordinary stress or the ordinary deterioration that high-pressure professional lives produce in the people living them. A sharpness in Norman's manner that went beyond his usual demanding quality into something that felt more personal and more directed, as though his irritability had acquired a target rather than simply a general object. An interest in Spider-Man that he expressed in the context of Oscorp's defense contracting work, but that had a quality of investment in it that exceeded what the business context required. Occasional moments in conversation where his attention seemed to go somewhere else for a fraction of a second, somewhere interior and not entirely pleasant, before returning to the present interaction with a smoothness that suggested the departure had been noticed and the return was deliberate. Peter catalogued these observations in the private ledger he maintained of the things he knew and could not share, adding each one to the record with the methodical patience of a scientist tracking data whose implications he is not yet in a position to confirm but that he is not prepared to dismiss. The full restoration arrived, as these things tend to arrive, at a moment of crisis that provided the conditions the underlying damage had been waiting for. Harry's latest and most serious episode with the substances he had been using as a way of managing an internal life that had become too difficult to manage directly, the specific desperation of an evening when Harry had made choices that scared everyone who cared about him, and that required the kind of emergency response that made everything that was otherwise being carefully not said suddenly impossible to continue not saying, provided Norman with the specific combination of emotional intensity and neurochemical disruption that was sufficient to breach whatever remained of the barrier between the life he remembered and the life that had been sealed away from him. Peter was not present for the moment of restoration itself, learned about it only through the evidence of what came after, but he understood, when the evidence presented itself, exactly what had happened. Because he had been waiting for it in the background of everything else for longer than he had allowed himself to consciously acknowledge. The scheme that Norman assembled in the weeks that followed the restoration of his memories was different from his previous campaigns against Spider-Man in the quality of intelligence behind it, because it was now informed by something his previous operations had not had access to, the specific and intimate knowledge of who Peter Parker was and what Peter Parker loved. Previous Green Goblin operations had been aimed at Spider-Man as a symbol, as an obstacle, as a representative of a kind of heroism that Norman found offensive in its implication that there were principles worth more than power. The operation he assembled now was aimed at Peter Parker as a person, at the specific human architecture of attachments and vulnerabilities that his knowledge of Peter's identity had given him access to. And the difference between these two kinds of aim was the difference between trying to knock down a wall and knowing exactly which stone, if removed, would bring the whole structure down. He chose Gwen. This choice, when Peter eventually understood it in its full deliberateness, revealed the completeness of Norman's understanding of Peter's emotional life, in a way that was itself a violation. The violation of having been studied so thoroughly by someone with malicious intentions that they could identify, with greater accuracy than Peter himself might have managed, what could not be replaced if it were lost. Not Aunt May, whose loss would have been devastating, but whose relationship to Peter was defined by obligation as much as by the specific ache of romantic love. The kind of love that is still, at least partly, about the future, and about hope, and about what life might become rather than only about what it already is. Not Harry, whose friendship was deep but whose own damage had already created a distance that Norman could recognise and assess. Gwen, because Gwen was the place in Peter's life where the future lived, where the possibility of something beyond the constant management of loss and responsibility had taken root, and because destroying that possibility would not simply cause pain, but would change the fundamental shape of what Peter understood his life to be. The planning that preceded the kidnapping was conducted with the thoroughness that Norman brought to everything he considered important, which meant that by the time it was executed there was very little margin for the kind of improvised intervention that had saved situations before, very little room for the spider sense to provide sufficient warning to allow for a response that arrived before the consequences rather than alongside them. Gwen was taken on a Thursday evening in circumstances that were quiet and efficient, and that left no witnesses and no trail that pointed in any direction except toward the challenge that Norman intended. The communication delivered through channels that ensured Peter would understand who was responsible and what was being offered, which was not negotiation but theatre, the staging of a final act in a conflict that Norman had decided would end here, in a way of his choosing, on ground of his selection. The Brooklyn Bridge has a quality in the nighttime hours that it doesn't have during the day, a kind of austere grandeur that the absence of ordinary traffic and ordinary daylight makes more fully visible, the massive cables sweeping upward from the towers in curves that have a mathematical elegance that is also somehow emotional, as though the geometry of tension and counterforce that holds the structure together has a beauty that engineering alone does not fully explain. Peter arrived there through the air, following the signal of his spider sense and the specific quality of dread that had been building in him since the moment he understood what was happening. Moving as fast as he could move through a night that felt too still for what it contained, and the sight of the bridge resolved itself as he approached into the sight of two figures on the upper structure, one of them on the glider and one of them motionless in a way that confirmed his worst reading of the situation before any other information was available. Norman had dressed for the occasion in the full Green Goblin costume, which was itself a statement. The choice to appear not as Norman Osborn unmasked but as the Goblin at full theatrical presentation, suggesting that what was happening here was not a confrontation between two people who knew each other's identities but a performance being staged for an audience of one, a demonstration in which the costuming was part of the message, and the message was about who had control of the situation and who was operating on terms established entirely by someone else. He had Gwen positioned on one of the upper structural elements in a way that emphasized both her helplessness and the distance between her and any surface that safety might be located on, and the specific arrangement of the scene, its staging, its geometry, its clear establishment of the variables and what they meant, was the work of someone who had thought carefully about how to construct a situation in which every available option produced an outcome of his choosing. Peter landed on the bridge structure and assessed the situation with the particular quality of attention that crisis produces, the rapid inventory of physical facts and spatial relationships and the specific positions of everyone and everything that mattered. And underneath the assessment, harder to manage than the tactical thinking, was the feeling, enormous and unmanageable and present in his body rather than in his mind, of seeing the person he loved in a situation whose danger was entirely his fault, entirely the product of choices he had made and a life he had chosen to live, and knowing that the only path through it ran directly through whatever Norman had designed it to run through. He could feel his own heartbeat in a way that his enhanced physiology usually rendered unnecessary to notice, loud and fast and indicating a state of physiological arousal that the tactical part of his mind registered as a liability he needed to actively counteract. Norman talked. This was part of what the scene required, the theatrical element that the Goblin persona had always favoured, the monologue that served simultaneously as distraction and as the delivery of the specific psychological payload that the evening had been assembled to deliver, which was not simply the physical threat to Gwen but the articulation, in the most explicit terms available, of everything that Peter's choices had produced, the names of the people he had failed to protect and the ways he had failed them, The catalogue of consequences that stretched backward through the years to the waterfront night that had set everything in motion, offered not as analysis but as accusation, as the definitive accounting of what a life lived as Spider-Man had actually cost the people who had the misfortune to matter to the person inside the mask. Peter listened to this with the disciplined part of his mind, while the rest of him was doing the calculation that the physical situation required. The assessment of distance and trajectory and timing that the webline solution would demand if it was going to be executed in the fraction of a second that the situation was likely to allow, the calculation of where Gwen was in relation to where she needed to be brought to and what the intervening space and the physics of the approach would require. He had been running this calculation since he arrived on the bridge, running it in the background beneath everything else, and the answer that emerged from it was not entirely comfortable, because the variables involved, the height and the distance and the speed that a fall from that height would produce in the time it would take any intervention to reach her, created a set of constraints that the comfortable version of the solution required to be slightly more generous than the actual physics of the situation guaranteed them to be. Norman released her without a complete announcement of the action, which was deliberate. The sound that accompanied the line's arrest of her fall was not loud. It was, in the memory he would carry of it for the rest of his life, very quiet, quieter than the city around them, and quieter than the wind through the bridge cables, and quieter than his own breathing. A small and specific sound that physics made in the space where the force of the fall met the resistance of the line and the biology of the person at the end of it. And it was the quietest sound he'd ever heard in his life, and it was also the loudest. He brought her to the bridge surface. He did not understand yet, not completely, not in the way that the full understanding would arrive in the seconds that followed, and the not understanding was its own kind of mercy. A brief interval of something that was not yet what it was about to become. She was still. The stillness was different from the stillness of unconsciousness, had a quality that his enhanced senses registered before his mind was willing to process what they were registering, and the interval between the registering and the processing was the last moment of his life, before it divided permanently into before and after. The Green Goblin's reaction to what had happened was the expression of a personality from which every constraint that might have moderated it had been removed, and Peter heard it from a place inside himself that was no longer entirely engaged with the external situation. A place where something had gone very quiet and very still, in a way that was not calm and would not be mistaken for calm by anyone who understood the difference. He moved. Peter hit harder than he had hit anything or anyone. He did not count what he did to Norman's costume or Norman's glider, or the structural elements of the bridge that became incidental casualties of the engagement. He was not, for those minutes, the Peter Parker who had learned from Ben's memory that power requires restraint. He was something simpler and more devastated than that, and the only thing that prevented him from crossing a line that could not be uncrossed was not principle. In that moment, principle was not loud enough to be heard, but the accident of Norman's own technology, the glider responding to a remote command that was mistakenly sent in the chaos of the confrontation, and finding, in the moment of its return, its creator between itself and where it was going. And this was perhaps the most clarifying thing about the night, that the world does not register the scale of a private loss, that the ending of something irreplaceable leaves no mark on the general surface of things, that the before and the after exist only for the person inside them, and that the rest of the world simply continues, as it always has, as it always will, on the far side of whatever has just happened to you. Grief, in its early stages, has a quality of total weather, something that fills every available space and alters the character of everything it touches, making the familiar strange and the manageable unmanageable, and the previously automatic, suddenly requiring a level of deliberate effort that the grieving person does not have available, because their reserves are entirely consumed by the primary task of continuing to exist inside what has happened to them. Peter had experienced grief before, had known it with Ben's death in the acute and transformative way that first losses of that magnitude tend to arrive, and he had believed, in the way that people who have survived one devastating loss sometimes believe, that having experienced it once, he now understood something about its shape and its duration, and its eventual relationship to the possibility of continuing, that the knowledge of having gotten through it before constituted a kind of preparation for the possibility of getting through it again. What the weeks following Gwen's death taught him, with a thoroughness that admitted no comfortable qualification, was that grief does not work this way, that each instance of it is its own complete and sovereign territory, with its own specific geography and its own specific weather, and that the map drawn from one does not transfer to another, that knowing intellectually that loss can be survived is entirely different from having access, in the middle of surviving it, to the experience of having survived the previous one. The difference this time was the guilt. Ben's death had carried guilt, the specific and searing guilt of a choice he had made that had contributed directly to an outcome he would have prevented with everything he had if he had understood in time what the choice was actually choosing, and that guilt had been foundational, had become the bedrock of his heroic identity. The thing he built his commitment to protecting others on top of, because the alternative to building something on top of it was simply to be buried beneath it. The guilt that came with Gwen's death was different not in its intensity but in its relationship to his agency, because the choice that led to Ben's death had been a choice he made freely in a moment of selfishness that he could identify and name and resolve never to repeat, while the choice that led to Gwen's death was the choice to be Spider-Man at all, the foundational choice, the one that all his other choices had been expressions of, and he could not resolve not to repeat that choice without resolving to abandon the entire structure of his life, and the promise he had made over Ben's memory, and the ongoing reality of a city that needed someone to do what he did. And so the guilt had nowhere to go, could not be metabolized into renewed commitment in the way that the earlier guilt had been, could only be carried, added to everything else that was already being carried, a weight without a use. The mornings were the worst. There is something about the transition from sleep to waking that grief exploits with particular efficiency. The brief interval each morning when consciousness is returning, but the specific content of what has happened has not yet been fully reassembled, when the person waking is not yet fully the person who has experienced what they have experienced, and then the reassembly happens, the facts arrange themselves back into their terrible configuration, and the day begins again from the same starting point that the previous day began from, this same weight in the chest and the same particular quality of a world that is not wrong in any of its external details, and is wrong in a way that those details do not begin to address. Peter woke this way every morning in the weeks after Gwen died, and lay in the specific quiet of his room, the room that was still the same room it had always been, with the same science texts on the shelves, and the same quality of morning light through the window, and assembled himself back into the person who had to get up and go through the day, and the assembling took longer each time and produced something less complete. He went to school. This fact, the simple and almost absurd fact that the academic calendar continued, and that his obligations within it continued, and that the administrative machinery of Empire State University did not pause for personal devastation, was something he engaged with in the manner of someone going through motions they have temporarily lost the ability to invest with meaning, present in his classes in the technical sense of occupying a seat, and producing the expected responses at the expected intervals, but absent in every other sense, the interior life that usually ran parallel to and enriched his engagement with external reality, now entirely absorbed by something that had no interest in physics seminars or laboratory reports. His professors noticed and said things with the careful indirection of people who are aware that something significant has happened and who do not want to intrude on it, but who also have responsibilities that include acknowledging when a student is struggling. He thanked them and told them he was managing, which was true in the minimal sense that managing requires only continued function, and not any quality of engagement with the functioning. The nights were different from the mornings in the specific way that they had an activity associated with them. The patrol, the going out into the city as Spider-Man and moving through its nighttime geography, looking for the places where his presence could prevent or interrupt something that needed preventing or interrupting. And the activity had during this period a quality that was neither the purposeful engagement of his early heroic years, nor the mechanical joylessness that complete depression produces, but something in between. Something that most closely resembled the behavior of someone following a script they have memorized so completely that the performance no longer requires conscious engagement, the lines and the blocking and the technical execution all proceeding correctly while the actor is somewhere else entirely. His spider sense during this period became something he relied on differently than before, because the attentional resources that he had previously used to supplement its warnings with active situational awareness were not reliably available, were instead caught in the undertow of everything he was processing, and so the sense itself had to carry more weight than it was designed to carry, had to function not as a supplement to his active attention, but as a replacement for it in the moments when the active attention was not accessible. This worked, in the limited sense that he did not miss things that mattered in any of the ways that missing them would have had serious consequences, but it also meant that he was operating closer to the margins than he had operated since his earliest and least practiced days, relying on his enhanced physiology to compensate for a diminished mental engagement that the physiology was not designed to fully substitute for. The web swinging, which had from the beginning of his career carried a quality that was as close to uncomplicated pleasure as his life reliably offered, the specific physical joy of altitude and momentum, and the clean geometry of a well-executed arc through the urban canyon, lost this quality during the months of grief in a way that nothing else he lost during that period quite replicated in its particular poignancy, because it had always been the thing that was purely his, the ability that existed for no one else's benefit, and that he indulged simply because it was available to him, and because it was good, and its reduction to a merely functional mode of transport was a small but precise index of how completely the grief had colonized what had previously been protected space. He swung from point to point with the efficiency of someone covering ground rather than the fluency of someone moving through a medium they are at home in, and the city below him, which had always been a source of something that functioned like affection, the vast and various living thing that he had committed to protecting, was during this period simply geography, the terrain his roots moved through, rather than the thing his roots were in service of. Harry's situation, which had been deteriorating over the same period with its own separate logic and its own separate momentum, added a particular texture to Peter's grief that was different from the texture of grieving for Gwen because it was ongoing rather than completed, because Harry was still alive and still in the process of becoming further from what he had been, and because the specific nature of his deterioration required from Peter a quality of witnessing that his own grief made it very difficult to provide. Harry had lost his father, and was processing that loss through the same substances that had been providing him inadequate relief from inadequate processing for years. And the escalation that Norman's death produced in his use of those substances was visible to Peter across the distance that his own grief had created, visible and comprehensible and heartbreaking and impossible to address, with the directness and sustained engagement that addressing it properly would have required, because Peter did not have in those months the surplus of self from which such sustained engagement with another person's crisis is funded. He tried. He showed up at Harry's apartment with the specific frequency of someone who understands that showing up is not sufficient, but who is also aware that not showing up is worse, who is doing the thing that is available rather than the thing that would actually help, because the thing that would actually help required a completeness of presence that grief had made temporarily inaccessible. They sat together and sometimes talked and sometimes did not talk, and the conversations that happened were shaped by what both of them could not say, Peter unable to share the full weight of his guilt, and Harry unable to understand the full context of his grief, and the silence between the things that could not be said was itself a kind of communication. The communication of two people who care about each other, and cannot in their current states fully access that caring, but who are present enough to keep trying. Jonah Jameson's editorials during this period reached what was perhaps their most sustained and most vicious pitch, fueled by the combination of Captain Stacy's death and Gwen's death, and the general public appetite for a narrative that explained both of these events as the consequence of a single identifiable cause, which Spider-Man was conveniently available to provide. The columns that appeared in the Daily Bugle across the weeks and months following the Brooklyn Bridge were not simply the usual accusations of recklessness or vigilantism, but something that felt more personal, more invested in the specific diminishment of the person behind the mask, as though Jameson's long campaign had acquired in this period an additional conviction that came from believing that recent events had finally proved what he had always maintained. Peter read them and felt a flat, exhausted version of the reaction they would have produced in him in a different emotional state, something that was too depleted to be the full anger they deserved, and too present to be the indifference that would have been more comfortable. The ways that his patrol activities were affected by the grief were not always reductions. There were nights, particularly in the first weeks, when the physical engagement of fighting provided a temporary and entirely unsatisfying but nevertheless real relief from the relentlessness of what was happening internally, when the pure demand of a physical crisis required all available resources and left no bandwidth for the grief to occupy, and in these moments he was briefly and guiltily grateful for the crisis, in a way that he did not examine very closely, because examining it would have required a more functional interior life than he had available. The relief was always temporary, and always followed by a quality of return that was worse than the baseline because the contrast made the baseline more vivid, but temporary relief from unrelenting pain is still relief, and he took it where he found it, and did not ask it to be more than it was. Mary Jane Watson existed at the edge of this period in a way that resists simple characterization, present but not insistently, available but not demanding, appearing in the geography of Peter's daily life with a consistency that was not the consistency of someone pursuing an agenda, but rather the consistency of someone who has decided that being nearby is the appropriate response to a situation that does not respond to more direct interventions. She did not try to talk him through his grief, or to provide the structured consolation that well-meaning people sometimes offer to the bereaved, the reframings and the silver linings and the assurances that time will make this bearable. She seemed to understand with an intuitive accuracy that surprised him, when he eventually had enough restored capacity to be surprised by things, that what he needed was not to be consoled but to be accompanied, not to have his grief addressed, but to have his presence in it acknowledged. And she provided this in the way that a good companion provides their company, without conditions and without the expectation of gratitude. Her own life during this period, the professional engagements and the social activities, and the general maintenance of a full existence that she had not suspended simply because someone she cared about was suffering, moved around Peter's situation without requiring it to be different than it was, and there was in this a respect for the reality of his grief that was more genuinely comforting than more focused attention would have been. She did not need him to be recovering in order to find his company worthwhile. She did not signal, through the subtle communications that the well-intentioned sometimes transmit to the bereaved, that his grief had a timeline she was hoping he would respect. She was simply there, and the being there was its own complete and sufficient thing, and he registered it, slowly and imprecisely in the way that things are registered when one is not yet fully capable of registration, as something valuable and something that distinguished itself from almost everything else available to him during those months. The specific shape of Peter's grief began to shift, not to diminish but to change its configuration, to become something that was present but that no longer occupied every available space simultaneously, that allowed for the gradual return of a more variegated interior life, one that contained the grief as one of its elements rather than being entirely constituted by it. This shift did not happen at a particular moment and could not be attributed to a particular cause, but rather accumulated across many small instances of something that was almost, but not quite, normal. A conversation that was briefly engaging, a problem in the laboratory that required and received genuine attention, a moment during a patrol when the city below him produced in him a faint echo of the feeling it used to reliably produce. The sense of it as a living thing worth protecting rather than simply a landscape through which he moved. The guilt did not shift in the same way or on the same timeline. The guilt remained, would remain for much longer, would in certain configurations remain for the rest of his life. Because guilt of the kind that attaches to irreversible things does not resolve in the way that acute pain resolves, does not have a natural endpoint after which it has been fully processed and can be left behind. What happens with guilt of this kind, if the person carrying it is fortunate and has the right internal resources and the right external conditions, is that it is gradually incorporated rather than eliminated, becomes part of the texture of the self rather than a separate and overwhelming presence, informs rather than consumes, is present in everything without being the only thing that is present. Peter would spend years finding his way to this relationship with what he carried from the Brooklyn Bridge, and the finding would not be linear and would not be complete in any final sense. But the direction of it was established in this period, in the months of the grief's most acute phase, when the first small returns of something other than the grief began to suggest that the self, which had existed before the bridge, still existed somewhere beneath what the bridge had done to it, and was, with great difficulty and no certainty of success, attempting to find its way back to function. And so, we rest here, at the edge of the story, in the quiet that follows everything that has been carried and everything that has been lost and everything that has, despite the weight of both, continued. The darkness that runs through Spider-Man's story is not the darkness of despair but the darkness of depth. the darkness of someone who has looked at the full cost of caring about the world and has chosen, in full awareness of that cost, to keep caring anyway. This is what heroism looks like from the inside, not the bright and weightless thing that triumph resembles from a distance, but the daily and ordinary and extraordinary act of getting up again, of choosing again, of extending toward strangers the protection that was not always extended toward you. Let that settle now, gently, into the quiet of wherever you are resting. Let the web of the story dissolve into the web of your own breathing, slow and even and sufficient. You have travelled somewhere tonight, through grief and guilt and the difficult beauty of a life lived in service of others, and you can set it down now, all of it, the way even the most faithful guardian must eventually set down their watch and allow the night to simply be the night. Rest now. You have done enough. The web holds.